My name's Derek, and this happened to me in the fall of 2017 when I was 34 years old. I was living in Southern Oregon back then, working freelance jobs here and there while trying to figure out what the next step in my life was. I had gotten out of a long relationship earlier that year, and with nothing holding me in place, I spent a lot of time outdoors, mostly hiking solo. It wasn't really about finding myself or anything dramatic. I just didn't feel like being around people. That October, I had a few days free and decided to head out into the Umpqua National Forest. I had found a route online that wasn't very popular, about 14 miles round trip, with a detour to a remote ridgeline above Crystal Creek. Most folks skipped that part and stuck to the main trail, but I liked taking side paths, especially ones that didn't seem like they'd been walked on much. I packed up 2 days worth of supplies, some extra water, my GPS, my journal, and a solar battery for my phone. I left my car at the trailhead early in the morning and started walking. The first half of the trail was quiet and peaceful. The trees were turning, gold and red leaves crunching under my boots. I passed 2 groups of hikers before noon, both heading the other way. After that, it was just me and the woods. There was no wind that day. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. I remember that clearly because it made the forest feel still in a way that wasn't natural. Even birds were quiet. By late afternoon, I had made it to the base of the detour trail that led up to the ridgeline. It wasn't maintained, but it was still marked. The incline was sharp, probably a 1,000-foot climb in just over a mile. It was rough, but I pushed through it. The forest got denser, more closed off. The ground was damp and full of roots. I had to use my hands to steady myself in places. I finally reached the ridge just as the sun dipped behind the distant peaks. The whole valley lit up with that orange-pink glow you get just before dusk. It was stunning. The ridge itself wasn't wide. There was maybe 15 feet between the steep slope on my left and a drop-off on my right that led down toward Crystal Creek. The trail followed the ridge for a while, mostly level but overgrown. I decided to make camp in a small clearing just off the path, about 20 feet from the edge. I set up my tent, ate a granola bar, and made some notes in my journal. I didn't have a fire since there were fire restrictions, and I didn't want to risk anything. As the sky turned dark, I lay down and listened to the forest. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't that I felt scared, exactly. It was more like my body wouldn't relax. I kept shifting in my sleeping bag, opening my eyes at every little noise. I thought maybe I was just wired from the climb. I finally dozed off sometime after midnight. I woke up maybe an hour later to a sharp cracking sound outside my tent. Not like a branch falling, something deliberate, steady, like footsteps. I froze. My brain raced, thinking maybe a bear or a cougar. I reached for the bear spray next to my sleeping bag and waited. The noise stopped. I held my breath. There was nothing for a long time, just the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then came another sound. It was low, not an animal growl, not even close. It was like a breath, a long, deep exhale close to the tent. I gripped the spray tighter. I didn't move. After about a minute, it stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. When daylight finally came, I stepped out slowly. The clearing was just as I left it, but there were prints in the soft earth around my tent. Not boot prints, not animal prints either. Just vague impressions, wide and shallow, the kind that don't leave a clean shape. I stared at them for a long time. Then I packed up. I decided not to go back down the same ridge trail. It was too steep and narrow, and I didn't like the idea of being boxed in. There was an old fire road marked on my GPS that looped around the other side of the ridge, longer but safer. At least that's what I thought. The trail quickly faded as I started down. It was all scree and loose dirt, no markers. Trees grew thick along the slope, and the sun was already hidden behind clouds. I moved carefully, using my hiking pole to balance. At one point, I slipped and scraped my arm on a sharp branch. Blood soaked my sleeve. I wrapped it, but it throbbed. Around midday, I came across something I hadn't seen on any map. A small cabin. More like a shack, really. It was tilted slightly to one side, covered in moss, would gone gray from weather. I shouldn't have gone in. I know that, but I was tired, and my arm hurt, and I just wanted to sit somewhere dry. Inside, it was empty, dusty, broken chair in the corner, rusted can on the floor. There was a smell, though, faint but sour like old meat. I tried not to think about it. I sat for maybe 10 minutes. That's when I noticed the wall. Someone had carved something into the inside wall of the shack. Long, deep scratches, not words, just straight lines. Dozens of them layered over each other, like tally marks but wrong, uneven and chaotic. I felt my stomach twist. I got up and left. The forest felt heavier after that. The wind picked up, finally, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The trees moved in strange ways. I kept hearing noises behind me, little snaps and shuffles, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. I kept walking faster now. My GPS flickered once and lost signal. When it came back, the trail had shifted. Or maybe I had. Couldn't tell. Started to rain around 3 p.m. Light at first, then steady. The trail turned to mud. I kept slipping. My hands were filthy, soaked. My bandage came off and the cut opened again. Blood mixed with rain. I was cold now, shaking. I hadn't eaten since the morning. I finally reached a flatter section near dusk. According to the GPS, I should have been less than a mile from a Forest Service road. But the path vanished again. No sign of human travel. Just wet trees and steep drops on either side. I started yelling, just to make noise, to hear something other than the rain and my boots in the mud. Felt like hours, stumbling and calling out. I slipped again and hit the ground hard, scraping my knee and knocking the wind out of me. I stayed there a while, just breathing. Then I saw something through the trees. A shape, not a person, a structure, metal. I forced myself up and walked toward it. It was an old fire tower, rusted and missing steps, but real. I climbed it slowly, one hand holding the rail, the other arm burning. From the top, I finally saw it. A road, cutting through the trees maybe half a mile away. It looked endless. I stayed up there until the rain stopped. I climbed down and walked toward it, step by step. I reached the road just as the sky went dark. My legs were shaking. I didn't know where I was exactly, but I knew someone would come down that road eventually. I walked along it until I found a service post marker. I sat beside it and waited. About an hour later, headlights appeared. A ranger truck. I didn't cry until I was in the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket. I didn't tell him everything, just that I got lost. I still hike. I still go out alone sometimes, but I never went back to that ridge, and I never will. Something about that place wasn't right. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't monsters. It was something worse. It felt like the forest knew I was there, and it didn't want me to leave. It was mid-September of 2016, and I had just turned 34. I was living in Southern Oregon at the time, working a construction job that paid well but burned me out. My weekends were my only real chance to breathe. I had gotten into the habit of hiking solo, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for entire weekends. The forest felt like the only place where my brain would quiet down. That weekend, I decided to hike a long trail I had only partly explored before. It was in the Umpqua National Forest, about 2 hours east of my apartment. I had looked up a trail that looped around a ridgeline, passed through some heavily wooded areas, crossed a few creeks, and wrapped back around after about 20 miles. It was marked as moderate, but I figured with my gear and pace I could do it in a long day or stretch it into an overnight if I wanted. I left early, before the sun came up, and parked my truck at the trailhead just past a forestry road. There were no other vehicles around. The air was chilly, and the forest was covered in that early autumn dampness that makes everything smell like pine and wet earth. I had my pack with me, plenty of water, trail mix, dried fruit, a little stove with fuel, and a freeze-dried meal just in case I decided to stay out. I had a tarp and sleeping bag strapped to the top. My boots were worn in and solid. Everything felt right. The first part of the hike was peaceful. I kept a steady pace through thick pine trees, the forest floor soft underfoot with needles and moss. The morning light started to filter in between the branches, giving everything that soft golden glow. The climb wasn't too bad, just a gentle upward slope that curved around the edge of a steep hill. I passed a few birds and saw some squirrels chasing each other. Deer tracks crisscrossed the trail. About 6 miles in, I came to a clearing where the trail split. One way led higher into the ridge, the other dropped down toward a creek. I decided to head toward the creek first, thinking I could refill my water and rest for a bit. The trail thinned out and got rougher. There were fallen branches everywhere, and I had to climb over a few logs that looked like they had been down for a long time. I reached the creek about 30 minutes later. The water was fast and clear, running over smooth stones. I sat on a rock, pulled off my boots, and let my feet cool in the water. It was freezing but felt good. I filled my water bottle with a filter and ate a handful of trail mix. The quiet out there was different than silence. It was deep. I could hear birds, the wind in the trees, and the occasional splash of water. But no people, no cars, no distant hum of anything. Just nature. After resting for a while, I decided to keep going. I had a GPS app on my phone and a printed map just in case. I started climbing back up toward the ridgeline, taking a narrow path that didn't look as maintained as the main trail. It was steep and winding with loose dirt and rocks. I had to use my hands to steady myself more than once. After about an hour, the trail leveled out, and I found myself on a narrow shelf of land with steep drop-offs on either side. The view was incredible. I could see across the valley, with layers of forested hills stretching out in every direction. But the path itself was sketchy, about 3 feet wide in some places, sloping slightly toward the drop. I kept my eyes on the trail and took it slow. That section felt like it went on forever. I was fully exposed to the sun, sweating hard, and my legs were getting shaky. Just when I was starting to wonder if I'd made a mistake taking this route, the path widened again and dipped back into the trees. I breathed easier as I got back under the canopy. That's when I started noticing things felt a little off. It wasn't anything big at first, just a weird silence, the kind that makes you stop walking and listen, like you're trying to hear something that might be out there. The birds had gone quiet. The wind had died down. Even the insects seemed to disappear. I chalked it up to being high on the ridge, maybe something about the way the air moved up there. But then I saw what looked like an old fire ring just off the trail, hidden behind some brush. I stepped closer and saw it had blackened rocks, some charred with still in the middle, and pieces of broken branches stacked nearby like someone had made a fire not too long ago. There was even a crushed can near it. That alone wasn't unusual. People camp off trail all the time, but there weren't any footprints, no flattened grass, no signs of a tent, just that small fire ring like it had been abandoned quickly. I kept walking. Maybe a mile later, I came to another clearing. This one was open and dry, with tall yellow grass and a single dead tree in the middle. There were bones near the base of the tree. At first I thought they were from a deer. I've seen bones before in the woods, usually picked clean by coyotes or bears. But these were different. Too small to be a deer, too big to be a rabbit. They were scattered in a way that made my skin crawl, like something had ripped the animal apart. Flies buzzed around them. I moved on quickly, trying to shake the unease. I was about 12 miles in now and knew I could either turn back and hike a long way in the dark or push forward and finish the loop. I decided to push forward. I figured I'd find a good place to set up camp soon. A few miles later, as the light started to fade, I found a flat spot in a small grove of trees. It was away from the wind, had a soft bed of pine needles, and was far enough from any water source to avoid bugs. I set up my tarp low to the ground, laid out my sleeping bag, and made a quick meal. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the tension in my shoulders. That night was one of the worst I've ever spent outdoors. I kept hearing things, branches snapping, something walking through the underbrush. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. I stayed completely still in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, heart pounding. Every sound felt louder than it should have. At one point, something brushed against the tarp and I sat up, holding my flashlight. Nothing, just empty trees and darkness beyond them. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight because I woke up with the morning light peeking through the trees. I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I packed up fast and didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to be done. The trail on the second day was rough. It was more overgrown and poorly marked. I had to backtrack twice because I lost the path. My legs were sore, my feet were starting to blister, and I was hungry. At one point, I slipped crossing a log over a creek and soaked my boot. I cursed and kept moving. The last few miles were a blur. I just kept my head down and followed the map. I remember passing through a dense patch of ferns and nearly stepping on a snake. I didn't even flinch. I just moved around it and kept walking. When I finally saw the forestry road and my truck parked just ahead, I almost cried. I dropped my pack into the bed of the truck, climbed inside, and just sat there for a few minutes with the windows down, breathing. I don't know exactly what happened on that hike. I didn't see anything I could report. Nothing attacked me, nothing chased me, but I've never gone back to that trail. Something about it felt wrong, like the forest didn't want me there. I still hike, but I stay on well-marked paths now, ones I know are used often. I don't go that deep anymore. That weekend shook something loose in me. I realized how easy it is to disappear out there, how far from help you really are when you're deep in the woods. That trail gave me a kind of respect I didn't have before. Respect for nature, for my own limits, and for the feeling in your gut that tells you when something isn't right. I still think about that fire ring sometimes, and the bones, and the silence. I'm not scared of the woods, but I don't forget what they can hold either. Not everything needs a storybook ending. Sometimes getting home is the best one you can hope for. I had just turned 38 when I decided to do something I hadn't done in years, go on a long solo hiking trip. I used to do that kind of thing all the time in my 20s, back when life felt lighter and simpler. But with the way work had been lately, and everything piling up at once, I needed to clear my head. I took a week off, packed my gear, and headed out toward northern Utah where I'd heard about a lesser-known trail that wound through the Uinta Mountains. It was early September 2023. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, and the trees were just starting to shift into their autumn colors. I parked at a small lot near a trailhead called Willow Pine Loop. The trail wasn't famous or anything. It didn't have online reviews or social media posts showing it off. That was the appeal. I wanted quiet. I wanted out. My backpack was heavy, but I had everything I needed. Food, a small stove, water purification tablets, a sturdy tent, and my old hiking boots that had been broken in long ago. I also had a satellite phone since the area was remote. I let a couple of friends know my rough route and estimated return date. Standard stuff. The first day was calm. The trail started with a gradual incline that followed a creek for miles. I passed through long corridors of pine and aspen, the wind hushing the world around me. I walked about 10 miles that day and set up camp in a clearing not far from the water. I boiled water, made some dehydrated pasta, and watched the stars. Felt good. I felt good. The second day, I pushed deeper into the trail. There was a fork in the loop that veered off into a narrower path. No signage, just a faded arrow carved into a tree. It wasn't on the trail map, but something about it called to me. I figured it was probably an older part of the trail that got decommissioned or just forgotten. I decided to take it. That was my first mistake. The path got steeper and less defined as I went. Shrubs crowded the trail, and roots tangled under my feet. I had to slow down a lot to watch my footing. I didn't see a single person the whole day. The air got colder as I gained elevation. I eventually reached a ridge with a stunning view. Miles of forest below me, mountains rolling out into the horizon. I took it all in, snapped a few photos on my phone, and kept going. I set up camp that night on the other side of the ridge in a patch of flat ground under a group of evergreens. The wind was stronger there, but I was tired and didn't want to backtrack. I ate quietly, then zipped into my tent and read for a bit with my headlamp until I fell asleep. That night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It was a sharp, snapping noise, like a branch breaking underfoot. Then silence. I sat up in my sleeping bag and waited. I couldn't hear anything else. I chalked it up to wind or maybe an animal passing through. Still, I stayed awake longer than I should have. My ears tuned for anything unusual. By the third day, The trail was almost non-existent. I kept moving forward, thinking I'd loop back around eventually. I wasn't panicked. Not yet. I still had plenty of supplies, and I was experienced enough to handle a little off-trail hiking. But then I twisted my ankle. It wasn't a bad twist. I didn't hear anything snap, but it hurt enough that I had to slow way down. Every step on uneven ground sent a bolt of pain up my leg. I tried to keep my weight off it, but that made hiking awkward and exhausting. I stopped more often and covered less ground. By the fourth day, I was starting to get worried. I hadn't seen a trail marker in over a day. I checked my satellite phone, but the signal was weak. I could send a text but not make a call. I sent out my location and said I might be delayed by a day or two. I didn't want to trigger a search team yet. I wasn't in real trouble. Not yet. That day dragged. The terrain was rough and my ankle throbbed. I ran low on water and had to hike downhill off-trail to find a stream. The detour cost me time and energy, but I found water eventually. I filtered it, drank deeply, and filled up again. I tried to hike back uphill, but it was too steep. I had to find a longer way around, which pushed me farther off the original trail. The forest felt different there, thicker, more tangled. Sunlight barely made it through the dense canopy. I saw claw marks on a tree and old, dried-out scat that looked like it came from a big animal. I kept my bear spray close. That night, I camped on a slope because it was the only flat spot I could find. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing rustling outside my tent. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, but it didn't help. My nerves were shot. The fifth day was bad. I woke up exhausted, sore, and hungry. I had plenty of food, but I didn't feel like eating. My stomach was in knots. I had a weird feeling in my chest, like dread, but I didn't know why. I just felt off. I pushed on. I thought I was heading west toward where the trail should have looped back, but I couldn't be sure. I hadn't seen a recognizable landmark in too long. I used the sun to guess my direction and tried to stay in a straight line, but the trees forced me to weave around constantly. Around midday, I found an old fire ring and what looked like the remains of a campsite. It wasn't recent, maybe years old, but it gave me hope. People had been there. Maybe I wasn't far from the trail. I rested there a while, then kept going. A few hours later, I heard something large moving in the woods to my left. I froze. Whatever it wasn't small. I didn't see it, but I heard it crashing through the underbrush. It didn't sound like it was running. It was just moving steadily, heavily. I stayed still until the sounds faded. Then I moved again, faster now, ignoring the pain in my ankle. I just wanted to get out. That night, I climbed up a rocky hill and set up camp there. The wind was brutal, but I felt safer being up high. On the sixth day, I finally caught a break. I found an old wooden trail marker, faded and half-rotten, but it had an arrow pointing downhill. I followed it. The trail was barely there, overgrown and choked with plants, but it was something. I moved slow, careful not to fall. By evening, I saw signs of more hikers. Boot prints in the dirt, a granola wrapper, a cairn made of stacked rocks. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I camped near a stream that night and slept better than I had in days. On the seventh day, I made it back to a real trail. I recognized it from the map. I followed it all day until I reached the parking lot just before sundown. My car was still there, untouched. I collapsed into the driver's seat and just sat there, breathing. I drove straight to the nearest town and checked into a cheap motel. I showered for what felt like an hour, then called the friends I'd texted. They hadn't gotten my message. The signal must have failed. They were about to report me missing. Looking back, I know I made mistakes. I went off-trail without proper info. I ignored warning signs. I didn't turn back when I should have. But I also stayed calm. I rationed well. I trusted my instincts. I've hiked since then, but I stay on the trail now. Every time I see a faded arrow carved into a tree, I walk the other way. Some paths aren't meant to be followed. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the northern part of Wyoming, near the Bighorn Mountains. I was 31 at the time, recently divorced, and I guess I just needed some time away from people and noise. I had been working from home for about 8 months, and being indoors all the time was starting to weigh on me. I figured some time in the wilderness would help clear my mind. I picked a lesser-known trail that branched off from a popular route near a campground called Forest Creek Point. The trail was unofficial, unmarked, but I'd read about it in a hiking forum. They called it Hollow Ridge Path. The appeal for me was the isolation. According to the forum thread, very few people ever took that path. Most turned back after the first few miles because it wasn't maintained, and the brush got thick. I wanted that. No one around, no schedules, no expectations. I packed carefully, double-checked my gear, and headed out on a Tuesday morning, planning to spend 3 nights out there. I parked my car at the base of the main trail and started hiking around 9 a.m. The first few miles were peaceful. The main trail was wide and smooth, used by day hikers and families. Once I turned onto Hollow Ridge, the ground changed quickly. The dirt turned to loose gravel, and the path narrowed. After about a mile, it was just a footpath, barely visible under fallen leaves and broken twigs. I hiked for most of the day and set up my first camp in a small clearing next to a dry creek bed. There were no signs of other hikers, no footprints, no trash, nothing. I cooked a quick meal and sat against a rock as the sun went down. The silence was thick. It wasn't like the quiet of being in a library or a quiet street at night. It was the kind of silence where you could hear your own breathing loud in your ears. That night, I struggled to sleep. I wasn't scared exactly, just uneasy. Every little sound outside the tent made my heart skip. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. I kept telling myself it was just deer or raccoons. The next morning, I hiked deeper in. The trail, if you could still call it that, had almost disappeared. I used a compass and marked trees to keep from getting turned around. The woods grew thicker, and the terrain started climbing uphill more steeply. I came across some old tree stumps that looked like they had been cut by axe a long time ago. There were also the remains of a rusted-out metal bucket half buried in the dirt. It looked like someone might have lived or worked out here decades ago. That kind of thing usually fascinated me, but for some reason it just made the air feel heavier. Around late afternoon, I found a flat spot near a rock face and decided to camp there for the second night. The wind picked up after sundown, and the trees creaked and groaned like old wood in a storm. Again, I struggled to sleep. This time, I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat. No nightmares, just this feeling that something wasn't right. I sat up and listened. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed up the rest of the night, just staring into the dark, waiting for morning. On the third day, I thought about turning back, but I was stubborn. I planned on 3 nights, and I wasn't ready to give up. I figured I'd hike a few more hours and then make my way back the following morning. That's when I came across something strange. A small pile of rocks stacked into a pyramid, about 2 feet high, in the middle of the path. It looked deliberate, too neat to be random. I walked around it and kept going, but maybe 100 feet later, I saw another one, then another. All the same size, same shape, spaced evenly apart. I don't know why, but they made my stomach turn. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but something about those rock piles didn't sit right with me. I stopped and stood there for a long time, just staring at the last one. I decided that was enough. I turned around and started heading back, but the way back wasn't as clear as I remembered. I followed my markers, but something felt off. I thought maybe I'd just gotten disoriented, but I couldn't find the tree I'd carved my initials into. The more I tried to retrace my steps, the more lost I felt. I had a GPS unit, but the screen froze. Dead. I pulled out my phone. No signal. I still had food and water, but not much. The temperature was dropping fast too. By late afternoon, I realized I needed to make camp again. I didn't want to, but it was safer than stumbling around in the dark. That night was the worst. The wind didn't stop. It howled through the trees, and branches snapped in the distance. I didn't sleep at all. I kept hearing something like footsteps in the leaves, sometimes close, sometimes farther off. I told myself it was just animals, but my nerves were shot. Every noise made me freeze. I stayed zipped up in the tent, knife in hand, eyes wide open until dawn. When it got light, I packed up and started moving again. I was cold, exhausted, and every part of me ached. I tried to stay calm, but I started to panic. I knew I hadn't hiked that far in, but I couldn't find my way out. Everything started looking the same: trees, rocks, brush. Around midday, I slipped on loose gravel and twisted my ankle bad. The pain was sharp, but I could still move, just slower. That's when the fear really kicked in. I was alone, injured, lost, and running out of supplies. I didn't want to die out there. I forced myself to keep going, even if I was just moving in circles. I figured staying still was worse. Late that afternoon, I found something. A thin wire fence, half collapsed and rusted, running between two trees. Beyond it was what looked like an old logging road, overgrown but still visible. I followed it, curved and dipped through the hills, but it was a path. After about an hour, I spotted an old sign nailed to a post. The letters were faded, but it said, "Forest boundary, no access." I didn't care. I followed the road anyway. Another hour passed, and I started seeing signs of people again. A crushed soda can, then a strip of caution tape tangled in a bush. And then, finally, the edge of the campground where I had parked 3 days before. I limped into the lot and saw my car. It was almost dark. I just leaned against the hood and cried. I drove straight to a small hospital in a nearby town. My ankle was sprained, not broken. I got patched up, hydrated, and rested. The nurse asked where I'd been, and I just said I got turned around hiking. I didn't want to talk about it. I still don't, really, but I never went hiking alone after that. Even now, when I go on trails with other people, I keep looking over my shoulder. I don't think I was followed or watched. I don't think there were any ghosts or monsters, but something was off in those woods. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe something happened there years ago and left a mark. I don't know. All I know is I came out different, more careful, more aware, and a lot less sure about where the wild ends and the real world begins. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 34. I'd taken a few weeks off work to clear my head after a rough breakup. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I needed time to myself. I packed up my backpack, loaded it into my old Toyota, and headed toward the northern part of Maine. I'd found a set of backcountry trails that weren't popular, and that was exactly what I wanted: solitude. I'd always enjoyed hiking, but this would be my first real multi-day trek alone. I had my tent, water purifier, emergency beacon, a decent amount of food, and a paper map I'd printed from an obscure website. The trails weren't even listed on the official park guide. That should have been a red flag, but I brushed it off. The map showed about a 45-mile loop that wound through dense woods, skirted around a few lakes, and past a couple of abandoned cabins from the logging days. I started the hike on a Tuesday morning. The trailhead was just off a gravel road about an hour from the nearest town. I parked, locked the car, and hoisted my pack onto my shoulders. It was heavier than I liked, but I figured I'd get used to it. The first few miles were peaceful, just the sound of birds and the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. By early afternoon, I'd made it to a small clearing near a pond. I sat down, ate some jerky, and checked the map. The trail was supposed to split up ahead, one path going straight and the other veering left toward the lakes. I wanted the lake route. It would be a little longer, but the idea of camping by the water sounded good. I must have missed the split. I walked another hour before I realized the terrain didn't match the map anymore. There was no lake in sight, and the trees were thicker than they were supposed to be. I stopped, took off my pack, and backtracked a mile. Still no split. I double-checked the map. The paper was damp from my sweat, and a few of the ink lines were smudged. I cursed under my breath. There was no cell signal, and the GPS on my emergency beacon was just that, emergency only. I wasn't in trouble, so I kept walking, figuring the trail would loop back eventually. I made camp on a slope that night, my tent slightly tilted but manageable. The woods were loud at night, crickets, frogs, the occasional rustling in the brush. I didn't sleep well, but I never really did on the first night. The next morning, I packed up early and started hiking again. The trail kept narrowing, then disappeared altogether. I was bushwhacking now, stepping over logs, pushing through brambles. My legs were scratched up, and my shirt clung to my back with sweat. Every time I thought about turning around, I told myself I'd find the lake soon. That afternoon, I found a cabin. It wasn't on the map. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the shutters hung loose. But the door was still attached, and the windows were unbroken. I walked up slowly, listening for any sign that someone else might be inside. Nothing, just the wind. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dirt. Dust coated everything. There was a table, a few chairs, and an old stove rusted out on one side. I set my pack down and looked around. The place gave me a weird feeling, like someone had just stepped out and might come back any second. I left after a few minutes. Didn't want to sleep there. I kept moving. By the third day, I was running low on food and water. My purifier was still working, but I hadn't seen a stream in hours. My legs ached. I started to worry. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees. I'd marked a few spots with broken sticks or scratches on bark, but I hadn't been consistent. I didn't want to admit it, but I was lost. That night, I set up camp in a dry creek bed. Bad idea. It got colder than I expected. I woke up around 2 a.m. shaking. I put on every layer I had, but it didn't help much. I lay awake, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to something move around outside. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon, but I never saw anything. The fourth day, I tried to hike west. The sun was my only guide. I moved slower, more careful now. Around midday, I slipped on a patch of moss and twisted my ankle. Not badly, but enough to limp. I shouted into the trees, more out of frustration than hope. No answer, just more silence. I rationed what food I had left, 1 protein bar and a few almonds. I stopped often to rest. Every sound made me flinch. A few times I thought I heard voices, but when I stopped to listen, it was only the wind through the trees. My head wasn't right. I felt heavy, not just tired, heavy, like the woods were pressing in. That night, I didn't even set up the tent. I laid out the sleeping bag and curled up in it, watching the sky fade from blue to black. I thought about my ex, about work, about how nobody really knew where I was. I didn't cry, but I wanted to. The next morning, I forced myself to walk. My ankle throbbed, but I had no choice. I followed a ridge line, hoping it would lead to higher ground. Maybe I'd see a road or a building. Hours passed. I saw nothing. I started shouting again every half hour just in case. Late afternoon, I heard something different. Buzzing. Not insects. Faint, high-pitched electronic buzzing. I followed it. After 20 minutes, I found a utility pole. Then another. I almost laughed. I was near a power line trail. I followed it downhill, pushing through the brush until I stumbled onto a gravel service road. It took me another 2 hours of limping before I found a ranger station. The door was locked, but there was a bench out front and a posted emergency number. I sat down and waited. Eventually, a truck pulled up. An older guy in a uniform stepped out, asked if I was okay. I nodded, then started crying. I hadn't eaten real food in almost 2 days. They drove me back to my car. It was still parked at the trailhead, untouched. I sat in it for a long time before I turned the key. I drove straight to a diner, ate 2 burgers, and called my sister. I didn't tell her everything, just enough. I never finished that loop. I never even found the lake. I kept that old map, though. Sometimes I look at it and try to figure out where I went wrong. I still hike, but not alone, and not off the map. Looking back, I don't think the woods were out to get me. They were just indifferent. It was me who wasn't ready. Me who didn't respect how easy it is to get lost. Getting out wasn't luck. It was stubbornness, desperation, and the faint sound of a power line in the distance. Could have gone the other way, easily, but I made it back. And now I know next time I'll plan better. And I'll never hike without telling someone exactly where I'm going again. It was the summer of 2017, when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. I was 36 years old then, recently divorced, and trying to find a new rhythm in my life. I wasn't looking for peace or clarity or any of that spiritual stuff. I just wanted to be alone for a while. I'd been hiking since I was a teenager and had enough backcountry experience to handle a few nights out there by myself. I had a good pack, a lightweight tent, and enough freeze-dried meals and water tablets to get me through 5 days. I chose a remote section of trail that looped about 45 miles total, crossing a few ridgelines and dipping into dense forest valleys. It wasn't a popular route, which was part of the appeal. I wanted to be away from people, noise, everything. I parked my truck at a small pull-off near an unmarked trailhead and locked everything up. The trail started off smooth and steady, winding through thick pines and shaded brush. I made good time that first day, covering about 12 miles and setting up camp near a slow-moving creek. That night was quiet, almost too quiet. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, realizing I hadn't heard a single bird or cricket, just wind brushing through the trees and the faint rustle of branches settling. I chalked it up to elevation or maybe the season. Not everything needed a reason. I boiled water, had a bland dinner, and slept without much trouble. The second day was when things started feeling off. I woke up early, around sunrise, packed up, and started hiking. The trail was less defined as I went deeper into the mountains. At times it felt more like a game trail than something meant for people. I kept my compass and paper map handy, since GPS didn't work out there. Around midday, I took a break on a slope and noticed something strange. There were boot prints on the trail, fresh ones, deeper and more defined than my own. They were headed in the same direction I was going. That wouldn't be weird on a normal trail, but this place was isolated. No signs of cars or other people near the trailhead. No campfire remains or trash, just these tracks that hadn't been there the day before. I kept going, trying to stay calm, but every few hundred feet I saw them again. Always fresh, always ahead of me. By late afternoon, I was uneasy. I started checking over my shoulder more often. To stop, listen, wait. Nothing, just trees and silence. I found a flat spot near a rocky outcrop to make camp that night. I didn't light a fire, just ate cold food and laid low. I kept thinking maybe it was another hiker, maybe someone hunting or doing trail maintenance. But the silence and those footprints kept nagging at me. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every snap of a twig sounded like it was right next to me. I laid there with my knife in one hand, the zipper of my tent half open, just in case I had to bolt. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight. When I woke up at dawn, the first thing I noticed was that the ground near my tent looked disturbed. Not a lot, just wrong. Pine needles shifted, small stones moved, like someone had walked around where I slept. I got out, checked the area. Sure enough, there were boot prints circling the tent, and they weren't mine. I hadn't moved once I set up camp. These were fresh and deep, like someone had been pacing or standing there. I packed faster than I ever had and took off down the trail. My goal was to cover as much ground as I could that day. If I pushed it, I could be back to the truck in 2 days. I didn't want to spend another night out here if I didn't have to. The trail narrowed even more as it twisted down into a heavily wooded canyon. The trees were dense, branches reaching low. I had to duck and squeeze between them. My nerves were raw. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound made me freeze. Once, I thought I saw movement behind me, a flicker of something between the trees, but when I turned, there was nothing. I started hiking faster, sometimes slipping on loose soil, grabbing trees for balance. I didn't stop for lunch, just chewed on a protein bar while walking. Around 3 p.m., I hit a clearing where the trail crossed a dry streambed. That's when I saw something that nearly made me turn and run. On a flat rock, someone had carved a crude symbol. Just lines and circles. Not any symbol I recognized. It looked fresh, like the rock had been scraped recently. There were boot prints near it, again not mine. I didn't touch it, just kept walking. I was getting close to the end of the loop, maybe 15 miles from the truck. I considered hiking through the night, but that could have made things worse if I got hurt or lost. I pushed on another few hours and camped near a steep incline that dropped into a valley. I made sure to set up my tent behind a thick wall of shrubs. No fire, no noise. I even covered my tracks where I could. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing things. Soft footsteps on pine needles, the occasional crack of a branch. I stayed still, hardly breathing. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just waited. At some point, the sounds stopped, but I never really relaxed. When the sun rose, I was already packed and moving. My legs ached. My shoulders burned from the pack. I didn't care. I just wanted out. The trail was rough that morning, rocky and uneven, and I slipped more than once. At one point, I stumbled and cut my hand on a sharp stone. I wrapped it in a bandana and kept moving. A few miles later, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Hanging from a tree branch was a small bundle of sticks, tied with what looked like old shoelaces. Not quite a doll, but close. I didn't stop, didn't examine it, just kept my eyes forward and kept walking. I made it to the last ridge around 3 p.m. From there, I could see the dirt road where my truck was parked. Relief hit me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I kept going, pushing through the pain, the fear. When I finally reached my truck, I unlocked it, threw my gear in the bed, and peeled out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was 2 hours away, in a small town with a motel. I checked in, locked the door, took a long shower, and tried to calm down. My hands were still shaking. My mind kept going back to those footprints, the bundle, the symbol. I didn't see anyone out there, not once, but I know someone was there, watching, following. I reported what I'd seen to the local ranger station the next morning. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I never heard back. I haven't gone hiking alone since, and I never will again. Sometimes, at night, I still hear those soft footsteps in my dreams, and I wake up staring into the dark, listening, waiting, just like I did out there. But I'm safe now. I know that. I live in a different state, near people, near roads and lights and noise. I still hike, but only on busy trails, never more than a day trip, always with someone else. I still don't know what that person wanted. I don't know if they were dangerous or just strange. But I do know this, I was being followed. And that's something I'll never forget. It was the kind of day that started off promising but turned into something far less welcoming as the hours passed. The sky had been clear, the air crisp, and everything about the hike in the dense woods of northern Michigan felt like it would be one of those perfect days in the wild. My name is Daniel, and I had been planning this solo trip for months. Just me, the trail, and my thoughts. I was 28, not exactly a seasoned outdoorsman, but I knew enough to handle the basics. That morning, I'd packed a light bag, grabbed my water bottle, and set off on a trail I had read about in a hiking guide. It was a loop trail that promised some of the best views of the forest and, if I pushed myself far enough, the lake that lay beyond. I had arrived at the trailhead around 8 a.m., just as the sun began to break through the canopy above. I signed the trail register as required and checked my gear one last time. It wasn't a particularly dangerous trail, at least not according to the locals, but something about it felt a little different. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. It was subtle, but there was something about the deep quiet of the woods that made me uneasy, even though I'd been out on trails like this before. The first mile or so was easy, just a gradual incline through a dense forest. The path was well marked, and the earthy scent of pine needles and damp leaves filled my lungs with every breath. The further I went, the more I became aware of the silence that surrounded me. Normally, on a trail, you'd hear the chirping of birds or the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. But here, there was almost nothing. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional wind stirring the trees high above. As I walked, I thought back to the last time I had gone hiking. It was over a year ago, and that hike hadn't been nearly as solitary. I had gone with a couple of friends, and though it had been a good trip, I remember feeling a bit disconnected from it all. This time, though, I was alone and the solitude felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was almost oppressive. About 2 hours into the hike, I came to a small clearing. The trees around it were thick, but the sunlight filtered through in such a way that the area was bathed in a soft, golden glow. There was a bench in the center of the clearing, one of those wooden benches that parks put up to allow hikers to rest. I decided to stop for a moment, take a break, and drink some water. As I sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. It wasn't a physical sensation. There were no sounds of movement, no shadows in the corner of my vision. It was just this nagging sense that something was watching. I shook it off. It was probably just my imagination. I'd been on enough hikes to know that the mind can play tricks when you're out in nature for a while, especially when you're isolated. I finished my water, got up, and decided to continue. The next stretch of trail was steeper. The path wound its way up a rocky hill, and it took all my focus to keep a steady pace. I tried to distract myself by thinking about what I would do when I reached the lake. I'd heard it had a small, secluded beach where you could sit and relax in peace. But as I climbed, the air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. My breathing quickened, and I noticed that the shadows seemed darker, even though it was still midday. The sunlight no longer reached the ground in the same way. I felt like the trees were closing in on me. At the top of the hill, I paused to catch my breath and looked out over the forest. The view was incredible, but it didn't feel as serene as I expected. The trees below me seemed endless, stretching far in every direction. Something about the vastness of the forest made it seem too big, too much. I moved on. The trail flattened out for a bit, and I started walking at a faster pace. I was just eager to reach the lake now. I had no particular reason to feel uneasy, but the longer I was on the trail, the more I wanted to be off of it. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel was the only noise I could hear. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I came to a fork in the path. I knew the trail split here, but I hadn't remembered the signage being so unclear. One path led to the right, and the other veered left. The right one, according to the map I'd studied earlier, should have led me to the lake. But the sign next to the left path had a strange symbol on it, something I didn't recognize. It wasn't much, just a mark that almost looked like a scratch or a smudge, and it made me pause. It wasn't the sort of thing you'd expect to find on a trail marker. I stood there for a while, trying to decide what to do. There was no clear answer. The right path seemed like the obvious choice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about it. I had the sudden urge to take the left path, despite my better judgment. Maybe I'd find something interesting. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't resist the pull. So I turned left. The path was less maintained. The ground was softer, the trees closer together. After only a few minutes, I felt a strange chill, as if the air had suddenly dropped in temperature. The further I went, the less familiar the terrain became. The dense forest gave way to a thicket, and the path grew harder to follow. There were no markers, no signs, just a tangle of branches and undergrowth. I was starting to get a little concerned, but I pushed ahead. After all, I wasn't lost. I could always turn around and go back the way I came. But that's when I noticed it. A faint noise, like a snap of a twig, followed by a soft rustling. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks, scanning the area around me. I was completely alone, or so I thought. But the sound came again, closer this time. I wasn't the type to panic easily, but this was different. I had been in forests before, but something about this place didn't sit right. It was too still. No birds, no animals, just silence, broken only by that strange noise. I stood still for a while, waiting, but there was nothing. No movement, no further sounds. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a squirrel or something small. But the feeling didn't go away. The path began to narrow, and the trees pressed in around me. It felt like the forest was swallowing me whole. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't supposed to be here. I finally came across a small clearing, and at first, I thought it was just a spot where the trail opened up. But as I stepped into it, I realized something was off. The ground was uneven, like something had disturbed it, and there were strange marks in the soil. Not just animal tracks, but something else, long, deep gouges, almost like claw marks. A sudden gust of wind rattled the branches above, and I instinctively turned to leave. But then I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was something that caught my eye. A small, crumbling structure, an old, abandoned cabin. I didn't know why I felt drawn to it, but I did. It was just the kind of place you'd read about in horror stories. A structure left to rot in the middle of nowhere. But there was no rational reason to be afraid. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of unease as I made my way toward it. The cabin looked ancient, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The door hung loosely from its hinges, and the windows were covered in grime. I approached cautiously, every step feeling heavier. There was something about this place that felt wrong, like it was pulling me in against my will. I reached the door and pushed it open. The hinges squealed in protest, and the smell that hit me when I stepped inside was overpowering. Damp wood, mildew, and something else, something metallic, almost sickening. The interior was dark, with only a faint light coming through the cracks in the walls. I took a few tentative steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick, heavy, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. And that's when I heard it again, the faint rustling of something moving behind me. Without thinking, I turned and bolted out of the cabin, my feet pounding the ground beneath me. My heart was racing, and I didn't stop until I reached the fork in the trail. I didn't look back. The rest of the hike was a blur. I didn't care about the lake anymore. I just needed to get out of the woods. I took the right path this time, and as I walked back to the trailhead, the strange feeling that had gripped me all day finally started to lift. I reached the parking lot just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty lot. I didn't look back. I don't think I ever will. It was early September of 2016 when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the mountains of northeastern Wyoming. I was 33 at the time, recently divorced, and trying to reconnect with who I was outside of everything that had crumbled in my life. I needed quiet, space, and a challenge. I'd grown up in Montana, spent plenty of time in the outdoors, and felt confident navigating backcountry trails. The plan was to hike a lesser-known stretch of trail through the Bighorn Mountains, starting near a place called Lost Creek and making my way to a small outpost on the other end, about 38 miles away. I spent a week preparing. I had a solid backpack, a light tent, freeze-dried meals, a decent water filter, and everything else I'd need. I had a topographic map of the area, a compass, and a GPS just in case. Cell service was basically non-existent out there, so I left a detailed itinerary with my sister in Billings, including my expected return date. The morning I started, the air was cool and dry, with that early autumn crispness that feels like freedom. The trailhead was empty. No cars, no other hikers. Just quiet pine trees swaying and the distant rush of a stream below. I felt good, lighter than I had in months. The first day went smoothly. I hiked about 11 miles, stopping occasionally to take photos and let the stillness soak in. I passed a couple of small lakes, each one clearer than the last, the kind of water that looked too pure to touch. That night, I set up my tent in a grove of aspens a few hundred feet off the trail. I cooked a meal, watched the sun dip behind the ridge, and fell asleep fast. The second day was harder. The trail narrowed and climbed into steeper, rockier terrain. I started feeling it in my knees and back. Around mid-afternoon, I lost the trail for the first time. It had turned into a shallow stream bed that blended with a dozen other little runoff paths, and I followed the wrong one for almost half a mile before realizing I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I doubled back, annoyed but not too concerned. I found the right path again and kept moving. That evening, I made camp in a dense patch of pine. The spot was level and dry, though a bit darker and colder than the night before. I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing branches snap outside, probably just deer or squirrels, but it made me restless. I got up twice to check around my camp, shining my headlamp into the trees, but saw nothing. On the third day, things started to shift. I woke up late, groggy and stiff. My legs were heavy, and my shoulders ached from the weight of my pack. It had rained sometime before dawn, and everything was damp. I had about 10 miles to cover if I wanted to stay on schedule. Around midday, I came across something that gave me pause. Tarp, just a corner of it, sticking out from under a pile of brush about 20 feet off the trail. It was gray, dirty, and weathered. I stopped and stared at it for a long time, my stomach tightening. After a few minutes, I forced myself to walk over. It looked like someone had tried to hide it. The brush on top wasn't natural, it had been placed. I used a stick to lift the edge of the tarp, my heart pounding. Underneath was a moldy sleeping bag, torn and faded. No body, no blood, just the bag, empty and crushed flat. There were a few food wrappers nearby, crumpled and bleached by the sun. It looked like it had been there for a while. I didn't touch anything else. I backed away, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just me and that old camp. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake it. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for sounds behind me. That night, I camped on a slope just above a small ravine. I picked the spot because it had a good view and felt more open. But I didn't eat much. I couldn't stop thinking about the tarp. Why would someone leave a camp like that? Why cover it up? I woke up before dawn, cold and clammy. I thought I heard a voice outside the tent. A whisper, like someone calling from far away. I sat up fast and unzipped the tent. Nothing, just fog drifting through the trees. My breath looked like smoke in the beam of my headlamp. I didn't sleep again. The fourth day was the worst. I was supposed to finish the hike that afternoon, maybe early evening, but about 3 hours in, I missed a turn. There was a fork where the trail split. One side dipped into a canyon, the other curved around the ridge. I took the wrong side. It took me hours to realize I was going the wrong way. By the time I stopped and really looked at the map, I'd already burned most of the daylight. I tried to cut across the slope, thinking I could reconnect with the main trail. It was a mistake. The terrain was rougher than it looked. There were deadfalls everywhere, thick undergrowth and loose rock. I slipped more than once, scraped my arms and knees, and twisted my ankle on a mossy root. Not enough to stop me, but enough to slow me way down. I didn't make it out. I had to set up camp again, this time on a narrow ledge just wide enough for my tent. Felt exposed. I didn't feel safe. That night I heard footsteps. Not animals, not deer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over dry pine needles. I held my breath, heart racing. They circled the tent once, then again. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I had a knife next to me just in case. The steps stopped after a while, but I didn't sleep at all. When the sun came up, I packed everything as fast as I could and started moving. My ankle was worse, and my back throbbed from the poor sleep. I pushed through it. I followed the ridge, trying to find my way back to the trail. After about 6 hours, I finally did. The sight of it made me cry. Just a narrow dirt path winding through the trees, but it felt like salvation. I didn't stop. I kept hiking until my legs felt like rubber. Late that evening, I stumbled into the ranger station at the far end of the trail, barely able to speak. The ranger gave me water and let me sit inside for a while. I told him I'd gotten turned around, sprained my ankle. I didn't mention the footsteps. I didn't talk about the tarp. I made it back to my car the next morning with help. I drove straight to a gas station, called my sister, and told her I was okay. I haven't gone back to that area since. I still hike, still camp, but not alone. Not like that. Sometimes I wonder what really happened out there. Who left that tarp? Who or what was walking around my tent in the dark? I'll never know, and that's probably for the best. All I know is I got out. I made it, and that's enough for me. It was the end of September, the leaves already starting to turn color, with the crisp air of fall hanging in the morning breeze. I was 28, and for some reason, I decided that this year, I would take on a solo hiking trip through the wilderness of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It wasn't like I hadn't hiked before. I've done it plenty of times, but something about this trip felt different. I wasn't exactly sure what drew me to these particular woods, but I had made the decision to take a week off work, grab my gear, and go deep into the forest. The trail I was following wasn't one of the heavily trafficked paths. It was a backcountry trail, less known, and it wasn't marked with all the flashy signs and mile markers like the others. This one wasn't a place for tourists or casual hikers. It was the kind of place where people like me, those who had some experience, go to push themselves to get away from the world for a while. There was a quiet peace that came from being isolated like that. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, just as the sun started to dip behind the mountains. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered here and there. I gathered my pack, double-checked my gear, and set off into the woods. I didn't have a strict timetable. I planned on taking my time, camping when I felt like it, and exploring the area in my own way. As the trail wound its way through the thick trees, the sounds of civilization faded quickly. I could hear the rustling of the leaves in the breeze, the occasional bird call, and the distant rush of a stream. The path itself was narrow, sometimes more of a faint track through the underbrush than a defined trail. The earth was soft and damp, and I could smell the rich, earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. The sun was setting behind the ridge, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. Around dusk, I found a small clearing by a creek, the perfect place to set up camp. I unrolled my tent and set up my stove. It had been a long day of hiking, and my legs were sore, but the quiet of the forest was calming. As the last light of the day faded and the night grew darker, I made sure to keep a small fire going, just enough to keep the chill at bay. The stars began to appear, one by one, as the sky cleared. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and I felt a deep sense of solitude, a kind of calm that was rare in my everyday life. I hadn't expected that I would begin to feel so alone. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The sounds of the night were all around me. The crackle of the fire, the trickling of the creek, and the distant hoot of an owl. But something else lingered at the edges of my mind. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, like I wasn't alone, like there was something out there, watching. I woke up several times, disoriented, listening to the quiet. Every time, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, the result of being alone in the woods. I would drift back to sleep, but each time I woke, the feeling of unease grew. By the time dawn arrived, the chill in the air had deepened. I packed up my things quickly, eager to get moving. I told myself it was just the usual nervousness of being alone in the wild. There was no reason to let the feeling get to me. I ate a quick breakfast of granola and coffee, and then I started walking again, following the narrow trail that wound deeper into the mountain. The path grew steeper as I went, the forest dense around me, the trees closing in to block out the early morning light. The ground was uneven, and I had to watch my step, stepping over roots and rocks. It was challenging, but it felt good to stretch my legs, to push myself further. It was a long trek, and by midday, I had made it several miles deeper into the wilderness. I stopped at a small stream for water and took a few moments to sit on a rock, enjoying the quiet. But that feeling, the one I couldn't quite shake, was still with me. It was like something was always just out of sight, just beyond the trees, keeping pace with me. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the normal paranoia that comes with being alone in the woods. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I tried to rationalize it. Could have been an animal, I thought. A bear or a deer, maybe. The kind of thing that moves quietly through the forest, staying just out of view. But that didn't explain the unease I felt, the tightness in my chest every time I stopped for a break or glanced over my shoulder. That night, I found a small, sheltered spot near a ridge, just above a valley. I made camp there, building a fire and settling down to cook my dinner. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Every time the wind rustled the leaves or a twig snapped, I jumped, my eyes darting to the shadows. It was hard to focus on anything, the night feeling thicker, darker, somehow more oppressive. Around midnight, I heard something, a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, dragging noise. It came from the direction of the ridge, from the trees that towered above the small clearing where I had set up camp. My heart pounded as I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't a normal noise. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. The noise stopped for a few moments, and I thought maybe it was just my imagination. But then it came again, closer this time. It was a dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled through the underbrush. I sat frozen, trying to listen, but there was nothing I could make out in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness. My hands were shaking as I scanned the trees, the beam flickering across the trunks, across the underbrush. The sound stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my breath, the crackling of the fire, and the distant rustling of the leaves. Then, just as I thought I was imagining it, I saw something move. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, something shifted. It was only a brief glimpse, too quick to make out any details, but it was enough to send a surge of adrenaline through me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, waiting for the noise to return. But eventually, the night grew quiet again. The dragging sound was gone, and the trees seemed to settle back into the stillness. The next morning, I packed up camp quickly, eager to move on. I couldn't get the image of whatever I had seen, or thought I had seen, out of my head. The rest of the hike was tense. I pushed myself harder than before, covering as much ground as I could, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. It wasn't until the fourth day that I finally saw it, the source of the dragging sound. I was coming down a narrow trail, the ground uneven and steep. I didn't notice it at first. The figure was blending into the background, its features hidden by the trees and rocks. But then, as I stepped closer, the light hit it just right. It was a person, crouched on the ground, their face hidden behind a mess of unkempt hair. They were dragging something behind them, a large sack, something heavy. My blood ran cold. The person didn't move at first, just sat there, still and unmoving. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to run, but I was paralyzed. Then the person lifted their head, and for a split second, our eyes met. I don't know what happened next. I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the pure terror that held me in place. But I did nothing. After a long moment, the person finally stood, slowly, and without a word, turned and disappeared into the trees. I stayed rooted to the spot, my heart racing, until I could no longer hear the crunch of footsteps. I couldn't stay there. I had to leave, had to get out. So I turned and ran, sprinting down the trail as fast as I could, my legs burning, my chest tight with panic. I didn't stop to think, didn't look back. I made it back to the trailhead by the afternoon, my body exhausted, my mind racing. The parking lot was empty, just as it had been when I first arrived. But this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to know if the person I'd seen was still out there, but I couldn't ignore the fact that I wasn't alone. I never returned to the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the western edge of Montana, near the Cabinet Mountains. I was 31 at the time, single, and had just gone through a messy breakup. I needed to clear my head, and the quiet isolation of the trails always helped me feel grounded again. I'd been hiking and backpacking since I was in college, and I considered myself experienced. I'd handled bad weather, steep terrain, and long solo stretches before. I thought I knew how to stay safe. I thought I was ready. The plan was simple. A 4-day hike through a less traveled route that looped through the mountains and brought me back to my car at a pull-off on a Forest Service road. I'd park near the trailhead, carry everything I needed on my back, and sleep in a tent each night. I brought my Garmin with me for tracking and emergency use, and I told my sister where I was going and how long I'd be gone. I even left her a map with my expected path highlighted. I didn't think anything would go wrong. The first day started easy. The trail was wide and flat at the start, shaded by tall pine trees. Birds chirped somewhere high above, and the wind moved slowly through the trees, making a soft rushing sound like distant water. I made good time, stopping only to filter water and snack. I was deep in the forest by the time I set up camp near a small stream. I'd seen no one all day. That's how I liked it. The The second day took me higher into the mountains. The trail became narrower and steeper, the air thinner. I passed through meadows full of wildflowers and loose rocky patches where I had to watch my footing. I crossed a wooden bridge over a fast-moving creek and spotted a deer standing still in the distance, watching me. There was something about that moment that stuck with me. The deer didn't move. It didn't seem scared. It just stared. By the third day, the trail had changed. The weather shifted fast. It went from clear blue skies to gray and cold, and a fine mist started to fall. I pulled my rain jacket out of my pack and kept going, but something about the trail felt wrong. The terrain wasn't matching my map. I should have been moving downhill by the afternoon, heading toward a wide bend in the trail near a valley, but the ground kept rising. I double-checked my Garmin and compass. I seemed to be on track, but it felt off. I pushed forward. Around late afternoon, I came across what looked like an old fire road. It wasn't marked on my map, but it cut through the forest in a straight line and was easier than the narrow trail I had been on. I made the mistake of taking it, thinking it would reconnect with my route. Didn't. The fire road descended into a thick part of the forest, darker than before. The trees grew closer together here, tall and bare at the base like toothpicks, their needles high above blocking the light. I started feeling uneasy. I chalked it up to being tired and damp. I was hungry too, and that never helped my mood. Still, I kept walking. I didn't want to backtrack uphill, and I told myself it had to connect eventually. An hour passed, then another. The fire road thinned out, then vanished. I stood in the middle of the woods, soaked to the skin, unsure where I had gone wrong. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The same trees, the same mossy rocks, the same broken branches on the ground. My Garmin had lost signal sometime earlier, and now it wouldn't reconnect. I felt that slow rise of panic start in my chest. I forced myself to calm down and set up camp before it got dark. I found a small flat area near a fallen tree and pitched my tent. I ate a dry granola bar for dinner. The rain kept falling, soft and steady. I crawled into my sleeping bag and lay still, listening. That's when I noticed it. No birds, no wind, no animal sounds, just silence. Heavy, unnatural silence, pressed against my ears like cotton. I couldn't hear anything beyond the tent walls, and the feeling of being watched crept in slow, like a cold draft through a cracked window. I slept in short bursts. Every sound jolted me awake. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Maybe it was just normal forest noise, or maybe not. When the morning came, I packed up fast and tried to backtrack, but I couldn't find the trail. I walked in circles. I checked the compass and tried to use the sun to guide me, but the clouds made it impossible. I felt like I was walking in place. By late afternoon, I started rationing my food. I was running low. The last clear stream I found had been the day before, and I was down to half a liter of filtered water. I had iodine tablets, but I hadn't seen any water to use them with. My legs ached, and my socks were soaked. Blisters had started to form. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in the tent, wide awake. I kept hearing footsteps, slow, measured steps that crunched the leaves. But every time I unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing. I told myself it had to be animals, maybe a deer again, but the steps had a rhythm that felt human. On the fifth day, I found a dry creek bed and followed it. Sometimes following a water path can lead to roads or lower elevations. I walked until my feet throbbed. My skin burned where it had been rubbing under the pack straps. My mouth was dry. I started getting dizzy. I almost missed it. A weathered wooden post sticking out of the ground, just barely visible between two trees. I rushed over. It was a trail marker, old and faded. It had a painted arrow pointing left. I followed it. 2 hours later, I came out near a Forest Service road. A pickup truck passed me maybe 20 minutes after I got there. The driver gave me water and drove me back to the main highway. I called my sister from the first gas station we found. I'd been gone 6 days. She had just called search and rescue that morning. I never figured out where I got turned around. I went back to the area months later, just to see it again. I couldn't even find the fire road that led me off trail. It was like it had never been there. I still hike, but I stay on marked trails now. I always carry a backup GPS. I learned the hard way that even when you think you know the woods, you can still get lost. Not everything out there is trying to scare you, but sometimes being alone, being truly lost, it changes something in you. I haven't forgotten that silence. I don't think I ever will. The sun was low in the sky as I started my hike, casting long shadows through the trees. I had always found peace in nature, but today, there was something off. The air felt heavier than usual, and the forest around me was unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the brush, just the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt path. It was the end of September, a time when the leaves had begun to change color, hinting at the coming of autumn. I had decided to take a solo trip into the backwoods of the Cascades, a range I had hiked through before. This wasn't my first time out here. In fact, it wasn't even my 10th. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't hiked alone in a while, or maybe it was just the feeling that something was off. Whatever it was, I pushed it aside and told myself that I'd get used to it once I settled in. The trail was familiar, a narrow, winding path that snaked its way through thick trees. It was one of those trails that felt like it could go on forever with no real landmarks to speak of. The kind of trail where if you didn't know exactly where you were going, you could easily lose yourself. I'd read about people who had done just that, lost themselves in the wild and never come back. I wasn't worried though. I had all the necessary gear: map, compass, extra food, water, and a GPS tracker in case anything went wrong. The only thing I didn't have was company. I had left my phone in the car. I didn't want distractions, didn't want to deal with the outside world. I had planned this trip as a way to disconnect, to clear my head. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the light began to fade. The trees grew taller and denser, blocking out the last of the sunlight. I reached a small clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was an ideal spot to set up camp, or at least to take a break. I could feel the weight of the day starting to settle in on me. My shoulders ached from the pack, and my legs were starting to protest the long trek. I set down my pack and took a seat on a large, flat rock, pulling out a small snack of trail mix. The quiet was unsettling. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, almost as if the world around me was holding its breath. I tried to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine, but it was hard to shake. After a few minutes of sitting there, I decided to push on. The campsite I was aiming for was still a couple of miles away, and I didn't want to get stuck setting up camp in the dark. I packed up my things, shouldered my pack, and got back on the trail. The woods were darker now, the trail more treacherous with loose rocks and uneven footing. I had to be careful where I stepped, especially as the ground started to get damp from the evening dew. The temperature had dropped too, and I could feel the chill creeping into my bones. That's when I heard it, a crack, a sharp, unmistakable sound of something snapping under the weight of a heavy footfall. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart suddenly racing. I scanned the forest around me, but all I could see were shadows. There was nothing in sight, no movement. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal. The forest was full of creatures, after all, and they made all kinds of noises. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to push the unease to the back of my mind. I didn't want to let my fear get the best of me. But as I moved further along the trail, the sounds around me grew more pronounced. Faint rustling in the underbrush, branches cracking, the soft padding of footsteps on the forest floor. It was almost as if someone or something was following me. I paused again, listening intently. Nothing, just the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Maybe I was just imagining things. I had to keep moving. I wasn't going to let myself get spooked by something as simple as the woods at night. But then, another sound. This time it was much closer. A grunt, low and guttural. It came from somewhere behind me, just beyond the reach of the trees. I froze. I didn't dare look behind me, didn't dare acknowledge the fact that there was someone, out there in the woods trailing me. I had to focus. I had to keep moving. The trail twisted ahead, but my mind raced in all directions. Who could it be? Another hiker? A hunter, perhaps? But the trail was too remote for casual visitors. I would have passed anyone coming in the other direction. Whoever or whatever was behind me, I hadn't seen or heard them before. And then it happened. The unmistakable sound of someone or something breathing heavily just behind me. My instincts kicked in. I broke into a run. I didn't know if it was a person or an animal. I didn't care. My only thought was to get away. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning as I sprinted down the trail, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The trees blurred by me as I tore through the woods, my breath ragged in my chest. But I couldn't escape it. The sound followed me, steady and relentless. It was too close now, too real. I didn't know how long I had been running when I came across a small stream cutting across the trail. The moonlight shone off the water, making the rocks in the stream look like silver. I could hear the water rushing over the rocks as I splashed across, my heart still pounding in my ears. The pursuit had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. I could hear it just behind me, getting closer. I was running on pure instinct now, my mind racing. I had to get to the campsite. If I could just make it there, I'd be safe. It was only a few hundred yards ahead. But then, a branch cracked underfoot behind me, and I knew it was too late. I couldn't keep running forever. I stopped dead in my tracks and spun around, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The forest was silent again, too silent. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and broad, with dark clothes that blended seamlessly with the night. He stood there, still as a statue, watching me. I felt my pulse quicken as I took in his features. Rugged face, unshaven, eyes wide but expressionless. He didn't say a word. He didn't move. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. My brain screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something. But I was frozen, caught in that moment, unable to make a decision. And then, finally, he stepped forward. Slowly, without thinking, I turned and ran again, pushing my legs harder than I ever had. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could hear him, still following, still coming after me. But something was different now. The path ahead was familiar. I had reached the campsite. I had made it. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, and for the first time I heard him speak. But it wasn't a threat or a demand. It was a simple statement. "I'm not going to hurt you." I didn't respond. I didn't have the energy to. I didn't care. I had made it out alive. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to do something different. I was 31, single, and spending most of my days sitting behind a desk in a small insurance office in Columbus, Ohio. I didn't hate my job, but I didn't love it either. My life was stuck in a loop, and I was craving something real, something I could feel in my bones. That's when I found an old map my grandfather left behind, folded into the pages of a dusty field guide to the Appalachian Mountains. One trail was circled in red ink, winding through southeastern Kentucky. It didn't have a name, and it wasn't part of any popular hiking route. Just a dotted line cutting through a dense stretch of forest not far from Pine Mountain. I packed my gear over the next couple days, double-checked everything, and left early Friday morning. The drive from Columbus to that part of Kentucky took about 5 hours. It was a mix of excitement and nervous energy. I arrived at a small parking pull-off off a back road that barely showed up on Google Maps. No cars, no signs, just trees. I put my phone on airplane mode to save battery and started hiking. The trail wasn't well maintained, but it was visible. It felt like walking into forgotten land. Vines curled along the ground, and thick trees arched overhead like old cathedral beams. It was quiet. Dead quiet. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own boots crunching leaves. I hiked for nearly 4 hours the first day, up and down hills, crossing narrow creeks and pushing through brush. I had planned to camp 2 nights and return on the 3rd day. My backpack was heavy with a tent, food, water, and basic survival gear. I found a decent clearing around 6 p.m., slightly elevated, dry, not too rocky. I set up my small tent, cooked some freeze-dried chili, and sat on a log as the sky darkened. I had no reception, so I wrote a few notes in my pocket journal. It was peaceful but unsettling. The forest here didn't feel the same as the ones back in Ohio. It felt older, heavier, like time didn't work the same way. Around midnight, I woke up, not from a noise but from a feeling. I sat up and listened, still dead quiet. No wind, no bugs. Even the trees seemed frozen. I stayed still for a while, hand on my small camp knife. Nothing happened. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, I packed up early. I wanted to make it to a small ridge that I saw on the map. It would give me a good view, maybe some good photos. The trail got steeper and harder to follow. At times, I had to guess where it picked back up. I slipped once on a patch of moss and hit my shin hard on a rock. It left a bruise, but I could still walk fine. I reached the ridge in the early afternoon. It was worth it. A wide view of the forest stretching out for miles. I could see low hills and thick woods with no roads or buildings in sight. Total isolation. I ate some jerky and granola, then decided to keep going a bit further before setting up camp again. That's when things started feeling strange. I kept seeing signs that someone else had been there. Not fresh prints, but older signs. A torn strap from a pack, a rusted canteen, part of a ripped tarp tangled in brambles. Nothing new, but nothing decayed enough to say it had been there for decades either. It felt like I was following a trail someone abandoned in a hurry. I didn't like it, but I told myself people hike these woods sometimes. Maybe someone got hurt and turned back. I set up camp again on a flat patch next to a slow-moving stream. It was quiet again, but I heard distant sounds that night. Not voices, more like low, scattered noises that didn't belong. A dragging sound once, maybe a snapping branch another time. Could have been animals. I convinced myself it was. On the third morning, I woke up to find something that changed everything. About 20 feet from my tent, there was a stick structure. 3 thick branches leaning together in a triangle, tied with what looked like old rope or vine. I hadn't seen it the night before. It hadn't been there. It was facing my tent directly, standing like a warning or marker. I didn't mess with it. I packed up fast, heart racing, and started heading back. But the trail was harder to follow now. Landmarks I had passed looked different. One hill was steeper. One creek felt like it had shifted. I wasn't lost, not yet, but I wasn't confident either. I kept moving, keeping the sun to my left, which should have taken me roughly northwest, back to the road. Around midday, I hit a dense section of woods that looked familiar but wrong. I should have been seeing signs of the old path, but it was overgrown. The underbrush was thick, and I had to push through it. I stumbled on what looked like a shallow pit filled with leaves and trash. Old plastic, a shoe, even an old pan. It looked like a campsite that had been torn apart years ago. I didn't stop. I pushed on, burning energy fast, drinking more water than I wanted to. My legs were starting to cramp, and my shin throbbed from the earlier bruise. I started feeling lightheaded. Maybe it was dehydration, or maybe it was the creeping panic. Around 3 p.m., I realized I was going in circles. I passed the same broken tree twice, 10 minutes apart. That stick structure was nowhere to be seen now. I sat down on a rock, checked my gear, and decided to stop for an hour to rest. I ate some trail mix and tried to calm my breathing. Then I heard something moving in the brush. Not close, but steady, like someone walking slowly. No talking, no animals, just steady steps. I held my knife again. The steps stopped. Nothing followed, but I didn't rest much after that. I started moving again, this time using my compass more closely. I stuck to a bearing and didn't deviate. It was hard. The land twisted and dropped in weird ways. It felt like the forest was funneling me away from where I wanted to go. By the time the sun started lowering again, I had no choice but to stop for the night. I didn't set up my tent this time. I found a dry spot under a rock overhang, kept my gear close, and stayed awake most of the night. I kept hearing noises, small, random, impossible to place. I kept the fire low, just enough to keep animals away. On the 4th morning, I felt awful. I was tired, sore, hungry, and on edge. But I got up, packed what little I had left and started moving. I found a dried stream bed and followed it downhill. Water always goes somewhere, I told myself. After a couple hours, I heard something in the distance. Not a noise, but a hum. A low mechanical hum. I moved faster, pushing through pain and exhaustion. I finally saw it. A power line running over a hill. I followed it until I reached a rough maintenance road. From there, it took me another hour to reach a real road. Pickup truck stopped when I waved it down. I looked like hell. The guy gave me water and a ride to the nearest town, which was about 30 minutes away. I didn't say much, just thanked him over and over. Back home, I looked up that trail again. I couldn't find any info. No records, no mentions online, nothing. It was like it had never existed. Even the old map was vague. I never went back. I still hike, but not like that. Now I stick to marked trails, popular parks, places with people nearby. What happened out there wasn't supernatural. I think I followed an old trail into a part of the forest that hadn't seen people in a long time. Maybe I stumbled into old hunting land, or someplace someone used to live off the grid. The stick structure still sticks in my head. It wasn't wind or animals. Someone built it. Someone saw me. I don't know who or why, but I got lucky. I made it out. Next time I might not. I went on a solo hiking trip in the fall of 2017. It was late October, just after my 33rd birthday. I had been working nonstop for almost 2 years at a warehouse job in northern Georgia, and I was worn out. I needed a break from the constant pressure, the machines, the beeping forklifts, and the same people every day talking about the same things. I loved hiking and used to do it all the time in my 20s, but life caught up with me. This was the first solo hike I had planned in years. I picked a trail in the Chattahoochee National Forest, but I didn't want to use one of the well-known trails. I found a lesser-known backcountry loop that wasn't officially listed on the park map, but was still marked by older trail signs. It was about 18 miles long and included several steep climbs, an old fire tower site, and a few creek crossings. The weather was supposed to be cold but clear for the next few days. I planned to take 2 days and 1 night to hike the loop, carrying only the basics: a backpack, sleeping bag, tent, food, water filter, and first aid kit. No GPS, just a paper map and compass like I used to do. I parked at a small gravel pull-off just off a rural forest road. My phone had no signal as soon as I left the main highway. There were no other cars. I locked my car, put on my pack, and started walking into the woods. The first part of the trail was quiet and peaceful, the kind of silence you only find deep in the woods. No road noise, no planes, nothing but the crunch of my boots on fallen leaves and the occasional rustle of squirrels. The trail climbed slowly for the first few miles. By early afternoon, I had passed a couple of landmarks listed on my map, including an old stone chimney, the remains of a homestead from the 1800s. I stopped there for a quick lunch and drank from my water bottle. I sat for a while on a mossy rock and let the sun warm my face. It felt good to be disconnected. There was no one around. I hadn't seen another person all day, which didn't surprise me. This loop wasn't very popular and it was the off-season. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped fast. I reached the area near the old fire tower site just before dark. There was nothing left of the tower except the concrete footings and a few rusted bolts. I found a flat area about 50 yards off the trail and set up my tent between 2 trees. I ate a cold dinner of trail mix and jerky, then crawled into my sleeping bag just after dark. The forest was dead quiet. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of branches cracking. Not just twigs, something heavier. I sat up inside my tent and listened. More crunching, closer now, like footsteps. I held my breath, stopped for a minute, then started again. I circled my tent slowly. I didn't have a gun, only a small folding knife. I pulled it out and held it, heart pounding. The steps finally faded away downhill. I waited, barely breathing. I didn't sleep again that night. The first light, I packed up fast and got moving. I figured it was maybe a deer or a black bear, though the way it moved didn't feel right. It had been too slow, too careful. The trail descended sharply after the tower site, into a dense patch of woods where the trees grew closer together. The forest felt different that morning, heavier, like the trees were watching. I tried to ignore the feeling and kept going. I had about 10 miles left to hike. Around mid-morning, I noticed a second set of prints near mine in the dirt. They weren't boot prints. They looked like trail shoes or maybe worn sneakers. I hadn't passed anyone. No one had passed me. The prints followed mine for a long stretch. It made my stomach turn. Someone had been behind me, close enough to step in the same mud. I stopped at a small stream to refill my water bottle and took a break. Sitting on a flat rock, I kept checking behind me. I saw no one, but the feeling didn't leave me. I felt watched. Every time the wind blew, I flinched, thinking I heard steps. By late afternoon, I had reached a narrow ridge trail. The woods dropped off steeply on both sides. I was about 3 miles from my car. That's when I saw something in the brush just off the trail. A torn piece of blue fabric, like from a jacket, snagged on a branch. I don't know why, but I froze when I saw it. Something about it felt wrong. I walked past it and didn't look back. About half an hour later, I heard movement again behind me. Not animals. I turned around and saw nothing, but I knew someone was out there. I started hiking faster, almost jogging at times, ignoring the burning in my legs. My heart was racing. I had this overwhelming urge to get out of the woods as fast as I could. I finally reached the gravel road. My car was just down the slope. When I saw it, I almost cried with relief. I rushed down the hill, legs trembling. I reached the car and saw that it was exactly how I left it. I unlocked it, threw my pack in the back, and got in. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station an hour away. I sat in the car there for a long time, just breathing. I never found out who was out there. I don't know if it was just a hunter, someone camping off the trail, or something worse. I reported the prints and the torn fabric to a ranger station the next day, just in case. They took a report but didn't seem too concerned. I haven't hiked alone since. I still go out into the woods, but never without someone else. I keep thinking about those footsteps, how they circled my tent in the dark, how close they must have been all day. Someone followed me out there. I know it. It didn't ruin the woods for me, but it changed how I see them. I'm careful now. I carry a GPS and a satellite phone. I check in, keep my eyes open. That trip taught me something. Nature isn't what you should be afraid of. It's the people who hide in it. It was mid-June, just past the longest day of the year, when I decided to take a solo hike along the Green River Trail. The sun was high in the sky, and I was at the tail end of my 20s, tired of the repetitive days of work and city life. A friend had mentioned this trail, but it was far enough off the beaten path that I didn't expect much company. The plan was simple: hike for a day, enjoy some quiet, and then head back. Easy enough, or so I thought. The morning of the hike was crisp, a little warmer than I'd hoped for, but nothing unbearable. I had packed light, just a small pack with water, some snacks, and a lightweight jacket in case it got colder by the evening. I told myself I wasn't going to overdo it. After all, this was supposed to be an escape, not a struggle. The trailhead was located a few miles off the main road, hidden deep in the woods near a small, remote town. The last time I had been out this way, it was for a camping trip with a few friends. We stayed for a couple of nights, but this time it was just me, alone. I wanted the solitude. As I began walking, the trail was soft beneath my boots, almost like the earth itself was welcoming me. The occasional crunch of leaves underfoot was comforting, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I was being swallowed by the silence. There were no sounds of distant traffic, no faint hums from city life, just the rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I knew the trail well enough from the map I had studied. It was a loop about 12 miles in total with some moderate elevation gain. Nothing extreme. The first few miles were easy, following the curve of the river, where the water looked clear enough to drink. But as the trail started to ascend into the woods, the path grew narrower. The trees closed in around me, and the sunlight became patchier, like it was being sifted through a dense filter of leaves. The hike was exhausting, but in a way that felt good. I didn't mind the sweat beginning to pool on my forehead or the ache in my calves. I was focused, lost in my thoughts, and just grateful for the solitude. Around mid-afternoon, I stopped by a small creek to refill my water bottle. I sat on a rock near the water's edge, listening to the soft gurgle of the stream as it passed. The forest around me felt alive in its own way. There were no signs of human presence, just an untouched natural world. I appreciated the peace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Something felt off. I ignored it at first. It was probably just the isolation playing tricks on me. After all, I was in the wilderness, miles from the nearest person, and the woods could play games with your senses. So, I got up and continued on, hoping the rest of the hike would clear my head. As I walked, the trail became steeper. It wasn't anything that couldn't be handled with a little effort, but it was enough to remind me that I wasn't on a casual stroll. The forest around me began to thicken even more, the trees stretching high, their trunks knotted and old. The air felt cooler, a sign that I was gaining elevation. But then, about 4 miles in, I noticed something odd. It was the tracks. At first, I thought they were just from a deer. The shape was all wrong, but something about them caught my attention. They were too large for a deer, and the way they were spaced out seemed unnatural, like whatever had left them was moving too quickly, too intentionally. I tried to push the thought from my mind, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I stopped and knelt to get a closer look. The tracks were deep, as though something heavy had walked through the area. My mind briefly wondered if a bear was nearby, but I had read that bears usually avoided human paths. These didn't look like bear prints either. I took a deep breath and moved on, trying not to let my imagination get the best of me. Still, I kept a watchful eye on the ground. The last thing I wanted was to walk into an animal's territory. The trail started to level out as I neared the halfway point, a small meadow with tall grasses swaying in the wind. From here, the view was expansive, and for a moment I forgot about the tracks. The sun was now beginning its slow descent behind the mountains, and the golden light filtering through the trees created long shadows that stretched across the meadow. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs. The smell of pine and damp earth was refreshing. I sat for a while on a large rock, soaking it all in. The hike had been tough, but I felt a sense of accomplishment. And yet, as I stared at the horizon, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling from earlier. Something wasn't right. It was then I heard it. A snap. Not a twig snapping underfoot, but something more deliberate. It was faint, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees. My breath came in shallow bursts. I couldn't pinpoint the direction, but I knew I had heard something. The air suddenly felt thicker, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to press on, despite the unease creeping into my thoughts. The trail beyond the meadow was less defined, winding through dense underbrush, and the further I went, the quieter it became. I began to hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. The forest was eerily still. No wind, no birds, nothing. It was as if I had stepped into a place where time itself had slowed down. Then it happened. A rustling from behind me, a sound that made my skin prickle. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the dense forest, the shadows stretching longer with the setting sun. I didn't stop walking, but now every sound, every movement in the trees, every whisper of wind, made me tense. I pushed myself faster, feeling the burn in my legs but refusing to acknowledge the fear growing in my chest. As the trail narrowed further, the thick trees seemed to close in around me. My steps quickened, and the silence weighed heavier with each passing minute. The thought that I might not be alone out here was a constant buzz in the back of my mind. The last few miles of the trail were difficult. The ground had become uneven, and I had to pay careful attention to where I placed my feet. Then, as the last light of day slipped behind the horizon, I came to the realization that I had lost the trail. The path had become a series of indistinguishable markers in the fading light, and for the first time since I'd set out, panic started to rise. I checked my phone for service. Nothing. Of course. My mind raced. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was supposed to be on a simple, easy trail. I was supposed to be fine. A sound broke through the night, something heavy brushing through the underbrush. I froze. I was no longer alone. The realization hit me like a wave, and my heart started pounding in my chest. The next few moments felt like hours. The sound moved, getting closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of branches, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the forest. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was out there. I turned back toward the direction I thought the trail might be. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I knew that would only make things worse. The trail was nowhere in sight, and if I panicked now, I might end up even more lost than I already was. So, I moved slowly, deliberately trying to maintain calm. I forced myself to keep walking, even though my legs were shaking and every instinct told me to bolt. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing, and to my relief, I saw the familiar sight of the trail marker, half hidden by some fallen branches. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me hope. I followed it, my pace steady but quickening as I realized that whatever had been following me seemed to have stopped. The rest of the hike was a blur. My mind was too focused on the sounds in the woods and the way the shadows seemed to shift with every step. But by the time I reached the trailhead, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I had made it. As I climbed into my car, still breathing heavily, I glanced back at the woods, the place where the unknown had lurked. My legs were sore, but I felt an odd sense of gratitude. Despite everything, I had found my way out, and just as I started the engine, I made a silent promise to never take a solo hike again. At least, not on a trail I didn't know well. The quiet of the woods had been more than just peaceful. It had been too quiet, too still, and next time I'd make sure I wasn't alone. The morning light had just started to creep over the ridge as I set off on my hike. It was early, too early for most people, but I liked being alone in the quiet of the forest. It was late September, the air crisp with the hint of autumn. The sun, still low, filtered through the trees, casting long, thin shadows on the path ahead. I had parked at the base of the mountain, far from the crowds that usually filled the popular trails. Most hikers would head for the easier routes, the well-trodden paths, but I was looking for something a bit more isolated. Something that would give me space to clear my mind. This trail wasn't marked on any popular maps, and that was exactly how I wanted it. A simple route that would loop around the mountain, nothing too strenuous, just enough to get a good few hours of solitude. The first part of the hike was easy, almost too easy. The trail wound through dense pines, their branches heavy with needles, the ground soft with fallen leaves. The air was fresh, smelled of pine and damp earth. I kept a steady pace, letting my mind wander, not really thinking about much. The occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves as small animals scurried nearby was all the company I had. I'd been hiking for about an hour when the trail began to narrow. The dense forest started to thicken, and I could see the climb ahead, steeper and less defined. My boots crunched over the gravel as the path twisted up the side of the mountain. I wasn't particularly worried, but I did feel a slight tension in my chest. It was the kind of tension that comes from being completely alone, with no one else around, just the sounds of the wilderness filling the air. There was something eerie about the silence. Not the kind of silence that's peaceful, but the kind that feels like something's off. I paused for a moment to take a swig from my water bottle, looking around. The forest stretched out in every direction, untouched, wild. Nothing seemed out of place. Just trees, rocks, and the occasional squirrel darting through the underbrush. I started moving again, picking my way up the path. It wasn't a difficult hike, but the steepness was starting to wear on me. I had to slow my pace, hands resting on my knees as I breathed heavily. The higher I got, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped calling, and the wind, which had been so noticeable at the base, seemed to have died down entirely. The only sounds were the rhythm of my boots against the ground and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet. The air felt heavier now, thicker, like it was pressing against me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the atmosphere felt wrong. I pushed on, telling myself it was just my nerves. I'd hiked alone plenty of times before. This wasn't the first time I'd been far from the beaten path. But with every step, it felt like the forest was closing in. The trees were taller here, more oppressive, their trunks thick and dark, casting deep shadows. The trail had become more of a scramble now, the path harder to follow. I was forced to use my hands to climb over rocks and pull myself up the steeper sections. After what felt like an eternity of steady climbing, I reached a small clearing. The view was stunning. Far below, the valley stretched out, the small town I'd driven through earlier now just a cluster of rooftops. The sky had cleared up, the blue of the morning expanding, and I felt a brief moment of relief. I stood there for a few minutes, enjoying the view, the peace of it all. But then something caught my eye. It was a small movement in the distance, just beyond the clearing. For a moment, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but then I realized that it wasn't moving the way an animal would. It was too deliberate, too controlled. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but I could tell it wasn't something natural. For the first time since I'd started the hike, I felt a genuine surge of unease. I stood frozen, eyes scanning the distance, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was a shadow moving at the edge of the clearing, just outside my line of sight. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to head down the mountain and get the hell out of there. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the spot, as if something was holding me in place. The shadow moved again, and this time I was sure of it. It was a person. Someone else was up here with me. I hadn't seen any sign of other hikers when I'd started. The parking lot had been empty. No cars had passed me on the road leading to the trailhead. There was no one else up here. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to keep moving, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, but something told me that wasn't the right choice. I needed to be careful. I wasn't sure why, but a cold dread had settled in my gut. I took a deep breath and started backing away from the clearing, keeping my eyes fixed on the place where I'd seen the shadow. I hadn't taken more than a few steps when I heard something. A soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the unmistakable sound of someone walking. My heart raced. I glanced around, searching for any place to hide, but the clearing was open, surrounded by thick forest. There was no cover, no way to disappear into the trees. I wasn't armed, and I had no way of defending myself if whoever it was decided to approach. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, suffocating me. The adrenaline kicked in, and I bolted, turning and scrambling back down the mountain as fast as I could. My legs burned with the effort, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me, that someone was watching me. I didn't dare turn around to look. The trail had become even more treacherous on the way down, the rocks slippery with the morning dew, the path narrowing in places until I was forced to slide down steep sections of loose gravel. The further I went, the more frantic I became, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Was it a hunter? Someone lost in the woods? Or was I being followed on purpose? The sound of footsteps behind me was almost drowned out by the pounding of my heart in my ears, but every so often, I'd hear it. A branch snapping, the soft scrape of boots against the rocks. I could see the edge of the forest now, the trail winding toward a clearing that would lead me back to the parking lot. I pushed harder, my legs trembling with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop now. The thought of someone behind me, getting closer, kept me moving. I burst into the clearing and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw open the door and jumped inside, locking it behind me with shaking hands. I didn't look back. I didn't even breathe until I was on the road, heading away from the mountain. I drove for miles, the forest fading in my rearview mirror, but the image of that shadow, the strange, deliberate movement, stayed with me. I didn't know who had been up there with me or why they were following me, but I never went back to that trail. And every time I drive past that mountain, I feel that same unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I'm not sure if I'll ever understand what happened that day. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was nothing. But something inside me says it wasn't. And I'm okay with never knowing. I just hope I'm never alone in those woods again. always been a fan of hiking. Growing up in the mountains of Colorado, my weekends were often spent on trails, whether it was the family cabin or just getting away from the noise of the city. But this hike was different. I wasn't with a group, nor was I heading to some well-trodden path that everyone and their dog visited. I decided to venture alone, far off any marked trails. A friend had told me about a secluded area up near Rocky Mountain National Park, an area that wasn't popular with tourists, the kind of place where you wouldn't see a soul for days. At 28, I had the experience to hike alone, or so I thought. I was in peak physical condition, with all the right gear and a good idea of how to navigate through difficult terrain. There was a map, a compass, a sturdy backpack filled with food and water, and, of course, a satellite phone just in case. I wasn't going to be reckless. The hike started out easy enough. The weather was clear, the temperature was perfect, not too hot but not freezing either. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees and bushes, the kind of place where the sunlight barely touched the ground. Birds chirped above, and I could hear the soft rustling of small creatures moving through the underbrush. But the further I went, the more I felt the isolation. The sounds of the world behind me started to fade, swallowed up by the vastness of the wilderness. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I couldn't help but feel a slight unease, an awareness that the forest was much bigger than I was. By the time I'd reached the halfway point of my journey, I had lost the trail. I wasn't sure exactly when it had happened, but I looked around and couldn't find the faint markings on the trees that I had been following. The woods around me felt thicker now, the trees more twisted and gnarled, as though the forest itself was starting to close in. I checked my map again, trying to get my bearings. The sun was still high, but I could already feel the days shortening. I wasn't too far off course, I told myself, just a little lost. Nothing to worry about. I pulled out my compass, rechecked my direction, and kept walking. That's when I heard it. It was soft at first, a distant sound that barely caught my attention. I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, more distinct this time. A slow, methodical crack, like someone stepping on a twig. I stopped, my heart quickening a little. I stood perfectly still, straining my ears to listen. But the sound didn't come again. It was odd, but I figured it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or a bear, although the latter was highly unlikely in this area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't know why. I'd hiked in areas with far more dangerous wildlife before, but there was something about this moment that felt off. I shook it off and kept moving forward, but the forest seemed to grow quieter the longer I walked. The birds stopped chirping. The wind died down. The rustling in the bushes ceased. It was as if the world had gone mute, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my quickening breath. And then it happened again. A loud crack, closer this time, much closer. My eyes snapped to the direction of the noise, but all I could see were trees and underbrush. Nothing moving. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, but something inside me was screaming to be cautious. I took a few tentative steps forward, trying to act casual, like I wasn't scared. But every muscle in my body was tense. I moved faster now, walking a bit more briskly, still trying to pretend everything was fine. The next hour was the longest of my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the woods. Every time I glanced behind me, I expected to see someone, a figure lurking in the shadows. But there was never anything, just trees, branches, and empty space. The path grew even more difficult to navigate as the terrain began to change, becoming steeper and rockier. My legs burned, and I was starting to feel the strain. I took a break on a large boulder, sipping water from my bottle. The silence was deafening. I had to find the trail again, or I'd risk getting completely lost. My phone was in my pack, but there was no signal. I couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration and helplessness. I wasn't prepared to be this far off the beaten path. Just as I was about to stand up and get moving again, I heard something. This time it was much clearer. A soft, muffled thud, like someone dropping a heavy object, followed by a series of lighter steps. I froze, my eyes scanning the woods. The sound didn't come from the direction I had just walked. It came from deeper into the trees. My heart rate spiked as my brain tried to make sense of it. I wasn't alone. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I could feel the presence now, a creeping sense of unease crawling up my spine. The next few minutes were a blur. I grabbed my pack and made a decision. I had to leave. I wasn't going to wait around and figure out who or what was following me. My mind was telling me to go, to move quickly, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone was watching me, tracking me, waiting for the right moment to close the gap. I moved faster, pushing my body harder than I should have. I wasn't being careful anymore. I had to get back to safety. Then, a sharp snap of a branch made me jump, and before I could react, I saw it, a shadow darting between the trees. It wasn't big, maybe human-sized, but its movement was fast and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought about running, but I didn't know where to run. I couldn't risk getting even more lost. The figure, whatever it was, disappeared into the trees, leaving me with nothing but a sickening feeling in my gut. I didn't wait to investigate. I didn't want to know. I just kept moving, faster now, my eyes darting over my shoulder every few seconds. I wasn't sure where I was heading anymore, but the need to get away from whatever was out there was more important than anything else. Hours passed, and it felt like I was running from my own fear. My legs were sore, my body aching, but I couldn't stop. Every step was filled with dread, my thoughts spinning out of control. Finally, I saw something, the faintest trace of a trail. It was barely visible, hidden beneath the underbrush, but I recognized it. I was back on track. I followed it slowly this time, carefully. I couldn't afford to get lost again. I didn't know if I was being pursued or if I was just imagining things, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of those woods. As the hours passed and the sun began to set, I finally found my way back to the main trail. My heart was pounding, but I could breathe a little easier now. I wasn't out of the woods yet, figuratively or literally, but I was close. By the time I reached the parking lot, the stars had come out, and the world around me was peaceful again. The fear, though, lingered. It would take a while before I could shake the feeling that something was out there, still watching me from the shadows. The moment I reached my car, I locked the doors, sat down, and let out a long, shaky breath. My hands were trembling as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't fully understand. Something that would never let me forget the time I spent alone in those mountains, and the fear that still clung to me long after I had left. It had been a long week at work, and I'd finally managed to get a few days off to reset. I had always enjoyed hiking and being outdoors, so I decided to head to the Cascade Range in Washington State. It was late October, a time when the leaves were just beginning to change color, and the weather was crisp but still manageable for a good trek. The plan was simple: take a solo hike up one of the more remote trails, spend the night camping, and return the next day. I didn't really tell anyone where I was going, not because I thought something would go wrong, but because I didn't want to worry anyone. I had done these types of hikes before. The trail I picked was a bit off the beaten path, mostly unknown to the average hiker, but it was still within a reasonable distance from the nearest town, so I figured it would be safe enough. When I arrived at the trailhead, I noticed there was a single car parked nearby, but other than that, it was quiet. The wind was gentle but carried a crisp edge to it, and the smell of pine and earth filled the air. I loaded my pack, tightened the straps, and set off. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. The path was well maintained, winding through thick woods that seemed to stretch on forever. I passed a few small streams that trickled gently through the moss-covered rocks. The sun shone through the canopy of trees above, casting dappled light on the forest floor. It felt good to be out there, away from the stresses of city life. Around noon, I found a small clearing and decided to take a break. I sat down, unzipped my pack, and pulled out a sandwich and some water. As I rested, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest around me was growing quieter, as though the usual hum of life was fading. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind had died down. It was an eerie silence, the kind that felt unnatural, like something was wrong. I brushed it off, Maybe it was just the isolation of the place, or maybe I was just overthinking things. After all, I was alone in the woods, far from civilization. Of course, it was going to feel a bit strange. I finished my lunch, packed up, and continued along the trail. As I went further, the path began to narrow, and the trees seemed to close in on me. The forest was thick here, and the air felt heavier, more humid. The occasional sound of a twig snapping or a distant rustle kept me on edge, but I pushed forward, trying to focus on the beauty around me. The trail was becoming more rugged, less traveled, and I had to navigate around fallen branches and rocks. It felt like I was entering a deeper, more ancient part of the forest. By late afternoon, I came across a fork in the trail. One path veered to the right, heading uphill toward a ridge I had planned to visit. The other, which was much narrower and overgrown with brambles, headed toward a valley that didn't appear to be on the map I had. I hesitated for a moment. The ridge trail was clearly marked, while the valley trail was a mystery. I stood there for a while contemplating. Something about the valley trail pulled at me. It wasn't marked on the map, and maybe that was why I was curious. I wanted to know where it led, even if it was off the typical path. Against my better judgment, I chose the valley trail. The further I walked, the more the trail seemed to disappear beneath the overgrowth. I had to push through thick bushes, and soon the path became little more than a faint indentation in the earth. The trees were so dense here that even the late afternoon sun barely reached the forest floor. The shadows were long, and the air was growing colder as I descended into the valley. As I walked, I started to notice something strange. The ground beneath my boots felt soft, almost spongy, like it had absorbed something, but I couldn't figure out what. There were no obvious signs of animals, no fresh tracks, no movement. Everything felt still, unnervingly still. The silence was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I was starting to question my decision to go off trail when I reached the bottom of the valley. There, I saw something that caught my attention. An old, abandoned cabin. The building was small and weathered, with moss growing on the roof and vines creeping up the sides. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung ajar on its hinges. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, staring at it. The thought of entering the cabin crossed my mind, but the place felt wrong, like it was hiding something. I wasn't sure why, but I felt compelled to investigate. I took a deep breath and approached the cabin cautiously. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The interior was dark, with only a sliver of light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Dust filled the air as I moved further in, disturbing the stillness. The wooden floorboards groaned under my weight. The cabin wasn't empty. There were signs of life, though it seemed like it had been years since anyone had lived here. A few old, rusted tools lay scattered around, and a small, faded rug covered the floor in one corner. It was unsettling, as though someone had just up and left in a hurry. But what disturbed me the most were the walls. There were markings, scratches, and what appeared to be old, faded stains near the corner of the room. It was hard to tell, but it gave the place an unnerving vibe. I stepped back toward the door, my heart racing. I wasn't sure what had drawn me here, but the longer I stayed, the more I felt like I needed to leave. Something wasn't right, and my gut was telling me I'd overstayed my welcome. I turned to leave, but just as I reached for the door, I heard something, footsteps, faint but unmistakable. I froze. I didn't make a sound trying to listen, but there was nothing else. No more footsteps, just the wind rustling outside. I waited for a moment, then slowly opened the door and stepped outside. My senses were on high alert now. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get back to the main trail and forget I'd ever come this way. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the once familiar path now felt foreign and ominous. I kept walking, my pace quickening, but no matter how far I went, the feeling didn't fade. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing but trees and shadows, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. By the time I reached the main trail again, it was almost dark. The sky had turned a deep purple, and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. I didn't even think about setting up camp anymore. I just needed to get back to my car, to civilization, and away from whatever had been lurking in that valley. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I finally allowed myself to breathe again. My car was the only one there, just as I had left it. I quickly packed up and drove away, the weight of the forest lifting from my shoulders with every mile I put behind me. To this day, I can't explain what happened back in that valley, but I know this for certain. There was something wrong about that place, something I'll never forget. I don't know what I heard in that cabin, or what had left those strange markings on the walls, but I don't think I'll ever be going back to that part of the Cascade Range again. And I learned one thing from that experience. Sometimes the things that draw you in the most, the things that seem the most intriguing, are the things you should avoid at all costs. It was late September, and the cool air of the early morning still hung in the trees when I set out on my hike. I had been wanting to do this for a while, go deeper into the woods, away from the bustling cities, and into the heart of the Sierra Nevada. I had no particular destination in mind. I just wanted to feel the solitude, get lost in the wilderness for a day or two, and find peace away from everything. The trailhead was empty when I arrived. The parking lot had just a few scattered cars, the usual hikers already off in their own direction. I threw on my backpack, adjusted the straps, and began walking. The sound of my boots hitting the gravel path echoed in the stillness, the only sound for miles. The scent of pine was strong in the air, and the forest around me was dense with towering trees. The first few hours were uneventful. I passed through a small creek, its water trickling over the rocks, and continued uphill, my breath getting heavier as I gained elevation. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I had enough experience to know how to handle myself in the wilderness. The trail was fairly well marked, but in some areas, it became harder to follow, and I had to rely on my instincts. Around noon, I reached a small clearing where I decided to take a break. I sat on a large, moss-covered rock and pulled out some water from my pack. I glanced around, taking in the quiet. The sun was high now, and the temperature was rising. I pulled off my jacket and wiped the sweat from my forehead, stretching my legs. The solitude was peaceful, but also a little unsettling in its stillness. I hadn't seen any other hikers since the trailhead, and something about that struck me as odd. Normally, there were at least a few others, especially on a weekend. I shook it off, thinking it might just be the time of year. Fall was coming, and not as many people were out. As I rested, I ate a small snack, savoring the silence. It wasn't until I stood up to continue that I noticed the change in the air. The wind, which had been almost non-existent earlier, suddenly picked up. It wasn't strong, but it had a chill to it that made me pull my jacket back on. I shook my head, wondering if I was just being paranoid. I carried on, following the trail as it wound around a ridge, the forest growing denser as I moved deeper into the wilderness. By late afternoon, the sunlight started to dip lower in the sky. The air had turned cool again, and the forest took on an almost eerie quality. The trees were so tall and thick now that they blocked out most of the fading light, casting long shadows across the path. It was getting harder to keep track of the trail. At one point, I looked around and realized I couldn't see any markers. I had wandered off the main path without realizing it. My heart rate quickened as I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. I wasn't lost, not yet, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. I stopped for a moment and took a deep breath. I was alone, yes, but I had my map and compass. I knew the general direction of the trailhead, so if I needed to, I could backtrack. Still, the sinking feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. It wasn't the first time I'd gotten a little off track, but the isolation of this forest felt different. As the light continued to fade, I decided to keep moving. I tried to push away the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just the solitude making me anxious. The sound of the wind in the trees, the occasional bird call, and the rustling of leaves were the only sounds breaking the silence. It was peaceful, but that peacefulness had a strange weight to it. Then, as the sun sank below the horizon and the sky turned deep purple, I heard something I wasn't expecting. a crack, a sharp snap of a branch breaking. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. It wasn't the sound of wind or an animal moving through the underbrush. It was deliberate, like someone or something had stepped on it intentionally. My heart started to race, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably just a deer, or maybe another hiker who had taken a different route. I told myself to relax, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I stood still for a moment, listening, but the forest was silent again. I could hear my own breathing, but no other sounds. I decided to keep moving, but my pace quickened, my senses heightened. Every crackle of a leaf, every rustle of a branch, had my head swiveling, looking over my shoulder. My flashlight was in my pack, but I didn't want to take it out just yet. I didn't want to look like I was panicking, but the further I went, the more the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was irrational, I knew that, but it was real. It was a primal instinct, like a warning bell ringing in my head. The path began to narrow as I moved deeper into the forest, the trees closing in on me. The shadows grew darker, and the wind began to pick up again. I felt small in the vastness of the wilderness, like an intruder. The forest seemed to be closing in on me, its branches twisting and bending like reaching hands. At one point, I stopped again to check my map. I knew I wasn't too far off the trail, but when I looked up, I froze. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the distance. Something large, dark, and fleeting. I squinted, but it was gone. Just a trick of the light, maybe, or my imagination getting the best of me. But something didn't sit right. I felt a presence. Not a ghost, not anything supernatural, but something else. It wasn't just the wild, untamed nature of the forest. It was the feeling that I wasn't the only one in it. I wasn't alone. I started walking faster now, the pace quickening into a jog. The path ahead was still unclear, the trees so dense it felt like I was running in place. The sound of my breathing was louder now, almost panicked. I could hear my boots crashing through the underbrush, and every so often, a twig snapped underfoot. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just ahead on the path. A shadowy shape, tall and thin, obscured by the trees. I skidded to a halt, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. It wasn't another hiker, I could tell that much. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I took a cautious step forward, then another. The figure remained still, but something about it made my blood run cold. I couldn't tell if it was a person or some trick of the shadows, but I wasn't taking any chances. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I turned and bolted in the opposite direction. My pack bounced wildly on my back as I sprinted, the sound of my breathing sharp and ragged. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. The forest around me was a blur, the trees like a wall, closing in and swallowing me whole. My legs burned, my breath coming in gasps, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Eventually, I slowed down, chest heaving, and found myself back at the main trail. The clearing was just ahead, and the distant sound of water running over rocks greeted me. I hadn't realized how much I had relied on the familiar sounds of the forest to keep me grounded. When I reached the clearing, I stopped and finally dared to look behind me. There was nothing, just the forest, as still as it had ever been. But that feeling of being watched, that unshakable presence, lingered. It took me a while to calm my nerves, but eventually, I realized that I had made it. I wasn't lost anymore. The sun had set completely, and the sky above was filled with stars. I wasn't sure if what I had seen had been real or just my imagination playing tricks on me, but it didn't matter. I had found my way back. The hike had been more than I had bargained for. It wasn't about the scenery or the solitude anymore. It was about the feeling that no matter how much I tried to shake it off, I wasn't alone in the woods. As I made my way back to the trailhead, the forest was silent once more, and the unease slowly faded. It was a relief to see the lights of the parking lot ahead. I couldn't explain what had happened out there. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe it was just a coincidence, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back to these woods anytime soon. It had been a long time since I'd gone on a proper hike, and this one was going to be different. I had promised myself it would be a day of solitude, a time to clear my mind. The thought of being out in nature, with nothing but the sounds of the forest around me, was exactly what I needed. It was early fall, around mid-October, and the leaves were turning that perfect shade of amber and gold. The air was crisp but not too cold yet, and the sky was that bright blue that made everything feel like it was in high definition. I'd chosen a trail I hadn't been on before, hoping it would be a fresh challenge. The map told me it was about 8 miles round trip, with a steady ascent that would lead to a small peak. From the top, it promised a sweeping view of the valley below. The trailhead was located about an hour outside of town, in a more remote area that not many people bothered to visit. It felt like the kind of place that, if you didn't know it was there, you'd never find it. Perfect for what I was looking for. I arrived at the parking lot around 7:30 a.m., with the sun just beginning to rise. It was quiet. There were only a few cars scattered around, and the area was still shadowed in early morning gloom. I grabbed my gear, a small backpack with water, some snacks, and a first aid kit, and slipped on my hiking boots. The weather had been unpredictable lately, so I'd packed a light jacket just in case. After adjusting the straps on my pack, I double-checked that my phone was fully charged and tucked it away in an inner pocket, just in case. The trail started off easy, winding through a dense thicket of trees. It was the kind of forest you see in movies: towering pines, thick ferns, and a soft, earthy smell that filled the air with every step. The path was well-worn and easy to follow. I moved steadily, my breathing steady, enjoying the rhythm of my feet hitting the dirt. I'd been walking for about 30 minutes when I noticed something odd. The air felt a little heavier, and the usual sounds of birds and insects seemed quieter. The deeper I went into the forest, the more the stillness enveloped me. I thought it was nothing more than the remoteness of the trail, the kind of quiet you get when you're far enough from civilization. Still, it made me feel a little uneasy. I shook it off. This wasn't my first time hiking, and it wouldn't be my last. I focused on the trail ahead and kept moving. About an hour into the hike, the trail started to get steeper. The trees thinned out, and the terrain became more uneven, with rocks and loose dirt making each step a little trickier. I slowed my pace to keep my footing steady. The view around me was starting to open up, and I could see the valley stretching out below. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the landscape. It was beautiful, the kind of view that makes all the effort worth it. But it wasn't just the beauty that caught my attention. There was something else, something subtle. A feeling. I'd been walking for a while when I heard it. A snap of a twig. Just one. It wasn't a particularly loud sound, but it was enough to make me freeze. I stood still, straining to hear anything that might follow. The forest had become unervingly quiet again, but this time it was different. There were no birds chirping, no insects buzzing. It felt as though everything had gone still, waiting. My heart began to beat a little faster. I couldn't see anyone on the trail ahead or behind me. I checked at the parking lot earlier, and there hadn't been any other cars there. I was alone, but that single snap of the twig made it feel like I wasn't. I pushed the feeling aside and forced myself to keep going. I reminded myself that animals often make noises in the woods, and it could have just been a squirrel or something else small. There was no reason to panic. But as I continued uphill, the feeling didn't fade. In fact, it grew. It was the sort of unease you get when you feel like you're being watched. It wasn't a loud sensation, but it was persistent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. It wasn't long before I reached a section of the trail that narrowed. The path had been carved into the side of a rocky ridge, with a steep drop-off to my right. I had to be careful with each step as I navigated the loose rocks and uneven footing. The air had grown colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The trail now seemed even more remote, like no one had walked here in years. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were faint at first, barely noticeable. But the longer I walked, the clearer they became. A series of deep prints in the dirt. Large, wide footprints. They didn't look like bear tracks, they were too regular, too symmetrical. And they were far too large to be human. At least, they didn't look like any human tracks I'd ever seen. I stopped and crouched down to examine them more closely. The soil was soft in this area, making the prints easier to discern. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. They were fresh, no more than a day or two old, if that. The mystery of it sent a cold chill through me. I stood up quickly and glanced around. The woods were silent once again. I couldn't hear anything moving, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was stronger now. I decided to keep going, but the tracks made me uneasy. I found myself walking faster, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with every step. Every sound felt amplified. The rustling of the leaves beneath my boots, the faintest creak of a tree in the wind, my own heartbeat. Another hour passed, and the trail became even more rugged. I was nearing the peak, the final stretch before the summit. The trees had mostly given way to open rock faces, and I could see the sky above me in its vast blue expanse. The summit was close, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to reach it anymore. The unease was building in me, growing steadily stronger. I reached a clearing just below the summit, and that's when I saw it. First, I thought it was a pile of rocks, a cairn maybe, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't rocks. It was a large, old backpack, the kind you'd see on a hiker, one that had clearly been abandoned. I approached it cautiously, my instincts telling me not to touch it. The backpack was dusty and worn, as though it had been there for a while. There was no sign of anyone around, no other signs of life. I opened the backpack cautiously. Inside, there were a few water bottles, some half-eaten snacks, and a weathered map. The map was folded neatly, and I noticed it was marked in a few places, all on trails I didn't recognize. The thing that struck me as odd, though, was the small notebook inside. It was tattered, the pages filled with scribbled notes. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. "They're watching. Can't stay here. Need to leave. They know." I froze. The words seemed absurd, but the more I read, the more my stomach twisted in a knot. It was clear that whoever had left this had been on edge. That feeling of being watched came rushing back to me, stronger than ever. I quickly closed the backpack and stepped back. My heart was pounding now. Every instinct told me to leave, to get down from the mountain as fast as possible. I could still hear nothing, but I was sure someone, or something, was out there. I didn't take the usual trail down. Instead, I found a narrow path that led through the trees. I didn't want to be seen. The unease that had started as a whisper now felt like a scream in my mind. I made my way down the mountain as quickly as I could, my legs aching from the constant descent. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made my pulse spike. I was so focused on the descent that I didn't even notice the drop in temperature until the sun began to set. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sky was tinged with pink and orange, casting long shadows across the lot. I didn't stop to look back. I got in my car and drove home, hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't know who had been out there or why they had left that notebook behind, but I wasn't going back to that trail. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how close I had come to something I didn't fully understand. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. The trail was still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. But as far as I was concerned, I was done with it. The forest around me felt alive in a way I hadn't expected. It was early spring, and the air still carried that crisp edge, sharp enough to make my breath visible in the morning light. I had taken the day off from work to escape the city, to find some peace on a trail I had never walked before. It wasn't a popular path. That was the point. I'd read about it online and decided to give it a go. No crowds, no noise, just nature and me. I parked my car at the base of the trail, tucked away in a quiet corner of the woods, far from the buzz of civilization. The parking lot had only one other car when I arrived. The silence here was heavy, the kind that only comes when you're far from any city. Even the distant hum of traffic was gone, swallowed up by the dense trees. As I laced up my boots, I felt a strange pull, an urge to get moving, as if the woods themselves were calling me forward. The trail started off simple enough. a wide path carved through the trees, a mix of pine and oak that towered above me. Birds called from the canopy, their songs echoing through the branches. I could feel the excitement of being alone in the wild, the thrill of being untethered for a few hours. I set off at a steady pace, the path winding its way upward as the trail began to climb. I had done some research on the hike and knew it wasn't too challenging. It was more of a scenic trek, something to clear my mind. But as I walked deeper into the woods, something about the quiet started to make my skin prickle. There was a tension in the air, something unexplainable that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was just the isolation, I told myself. Out here, no one could hear you scream. The trail narrowed and the forest grew thicker. The trees crowded in around me, their trunks large and gnarled. There was something hauntingly beautiful about it. The way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, a fresh and earthy scent that filled my lungs with each breath. Hours passed, or at least it felt like it. Time seemed to blur here. My legs started to ache, and I was beginning to question how far I had come when I noticed something odd. There was no sign of the other hiker who had been in the parking lot. He or she had probably taken another route, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, but the woods remained still. Just trees, leaves, and the occasional scurrying sound of small animals. Eventually, the trail opened up into a small clearing. It was peaceful, almost like a hidden glade, with moss-covered rocks and a trickling stream that cut through the middle. I stopped to rest for a moment, pulling out a water bottle from my pack. I sat on one of the rocks, letting the quiet wash over me. There was a calm here, a sense of being utterly alone, but in a way that felt safe, not threatening. But as I sat there, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement near the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat as I turned my head. It was a person, barely visible behind the trees, their figure half hidden in the shadows. I froze, staring at them, unsure if I had imagined it. I wasn't used to seeing people so deep in the woods, and the timing seemed odd. For a moment, I debated whether to call out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The person didn't seem to notice me at all. They stood there, unmoving, just watching. Something about their stillness was unsettling. I stood up slowly, heart hammering in my chest, and began to backtrack, my feet making no noise on the soft, pine needle-covered ground. But as I moved, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't alone. There were two more behind it, emerging from the trees with a slow, deliberate pace. They weren't moving like hikers. They were moving with a strange, unnatural calm, as if they weren't concerned about making noise or being seen. I turned, walking faster now, trying not to make a sound. But the crunch of a twig underfoot was enough to alert them. I heard one of them move behind me, their steps swift and sure. Panic gripped me as I broke into a run. The trail, which had seemed so inviting earlier, now felt like a trap. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps close, too close. The path was narrow now, the trees closing in on either side. My breathing became ragged, and my legs burned from the sudden exertion. I could hear the rustle of branches above me as I ducked under low-hanging limbs, trying to outrun whoever was chasing me. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but the only thing I could think of was getting away. I turned a sharp corner in the trail, my foot catching on a root, sending me sprawling forward onto the ground. Pain shot through my ankle, and I gritted my teeth, pushing myself up as quickly as I could. I had no time to think about the injury. The footsteps were closer now, too close. I glanced behind me and saw a blur of motion. One of them had caught up to me, a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadows. He reached out, grabbing the back of my jacket and pulling me back. My heart pounded as I fought against his grip, my hands scrambling for anything I could use to break free. But just as suddenly as he grabbed me, he released me. There was a sound, a loud crash from further down the trail, followed by more movement. The man and the others seemed to hesitate, looking at each other for a split second. Then, without a word, they turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. I lay on the ground for a long moment, trying to catch my breath, the pain in my ankle a dull throb in the background. I didn't know who those people were or what they wanted, but I didn't stick around to find out. My heart was still racing as I hobbled to my feet, leaning heavily on a tree for support. The rest of the hike was a blur of adrenaline and fear. My ankle throbbed with every step, but I couldn't slow down. I needed to get back to my car. I didn't care if I had to crawl. The woods felt so much darker now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I saw my car still sitting there, waiting. The parking lot was empty now, no sign of anyone else. I got in quickly, locking the doors behind me, and drove off without looking back. I never went back to those woods. In fact, I've never gone back to any trail alone since. There's a part of me that will always wonder what those people were doing out there, and why they let me go. Maybe they were just as lost as I was, but deep down, I know there was something off about it. Something that didn't sit right. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the rustling of the leaves, the crunch of footsteps behind me. It's a sound I'll never forget.